You need to unmute yourself.
I was saying good morning to you, Madam Chair. I apologize. And it's not the afternoon. Good afternoon. I've also never shared a screen before, so I'm going to hope that it works seamlessly. All right. Can you all see the presentation?
It's up fine.
All right. Okay, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's great to be back here before you today, albeit virtually and in a bit of a strange and awkward format. So I hope to be as personable as possible as we move through this. So today I'm going to be presenting an overview of the agency. I'm going to be sharing some exciting news with updates, and I will also be providing you with some updated information on our agency's efforts as we have navigated through the pandemic that we are experiencing at present. So if I were there in real life, I would probably have members of my team with me. And so I've provided you with this picture to introduce you virtually to members of my team. You'll see here Director John Gay, who is over the Adult Prisons Division, Director Melanie Martinez for Probation and Parole, and she will be speaking to you shortly after I present. George Stevenson, the Director of the Training Academy, Morgan Jaco, the Director of the Reentry Division, Robert Leon, the Director of Corrections Industries, Ed Smith, our Acting Director of Administrative Services Division, Brianne Begay, our Chief Legal Counsel, Jerry Brenniger, he's our Chief Information Officer, Dr. Wendy Price is our Behavioral Health Bureau Chief, Mr. Wenceslas Asangani is our Health Services Administrator, and Eric Harrison is our Public Relations Officer. So I got together with this group of people and we all worked to figure out what our mission was for the agency, our vision, and what our values are. So all of these folks, they bring really vast experience to the team. They're all very creative spirits and they have a wealth of information and experience between them. And in our group, we came up with this mission, which you see before you on the screen there. Our mission is to strengthen New Mexico communities through effective supervision, creating safe and professional institutional environments, and providing those entrusted to our care with opportunities for positive personal growth and self-development. And we envision a stronger New Mexico through these efforts. Our values we've identified are respect, integrity, service, and encouragement. This is a slide, a very high level overview of the organizational structure, which has gone through some pretty significant revision over the last year. So when I entered into the agency, I talked with you all a lot about some of the things that I saw when I first got here. And one of the most notable things was that the area that was previously referred to as the Recidivism Reduction and Reentry Bureau had all been but decimated. I mean, I think I told you there were 3 individuals who were working in that area, and they were just struggling to find support in institutions and within field services to get their jobs done. And so one of the main things I wanted to do was make a major focus on that. So that area has been elevated from a bureau and is now known as the Reentry Division, which you see there under the Deputy Secretary. We also made some changes with respect to things like the Office of Professional Standards and other areas like the Training Academy, which I'll get into here on the next slide. So that Reentry Division, it really was a very serious need. And I'm going to go over a whole slide with nothing but information on the Reentry Division, but at a high level, we created the Bureau. We took some staff members that were previously reporting to the Adult Prisons Division under Volunteer and Religious Services, and we relocated them into this new division. And we also took some staff members and some duties and functions from the Adult Prisons Division and from the Community Offender Management Area Field Services, and we have integrated them together to work towards successful pre-release planning that will really focus on every single individual that's getting ready to release to the community. Next, you'll see the Internal Affairs and Office of Professional Standards. Now, that area I explained to everybody, but I just want to give a quick oversight of what it looked like. When I first came in, this area had been, it just exploded. And there were, 15 or so of these people located throughout the state, investigators located throughout the state, whose sole focus was to place staff members under administrative investigation and to conduct those investigations. This led to all kinds of different areas or issues rather, in that staff members weren't being directly held accountable at local levels, and the emphasis just clearly had been shifted away from providing services to offenders and inmates in our custody. So what I did was I took that area and I relocated it to the Office of the General Counsel. It's been significantly downsized and now is much more appropriately suited for the size of the agency and is still able to manage all of the internal investigations that they receive. The next area was the Security Threat Intelligence Unit. Now, this area was something that was interesting to see because it was previously, at one point in time, it was two separate areas. One of them was in the institutions and another one provided services out into the field. But over time, it changed and it turned into this fugitive apprehension group. And there was a group of staff members that their sole function was to look for people who had been identified as absconders. And they were all technically certified probation and parole officers, but their sole function was simply to deal with finding or locating absconders, which meant that the probation and parole officers in the field offices were not staying focused on their individual caseloads, and then high-risk individuals were being still supervised out of regular district and region offices. So what this change has done is that it has placed the experts with institutional knowledge and awareness back into the institutions, and it has redirected the supervision of high-risk individuals back to the field services offices. This is significant because what it's done is it's freed up a lot of the specially trained probation and parole officers to focus on people that have both high risks and high needs. And it has also made it such that these people with the specialized training, they've all taken on caseloads, and they all will be supervising now very high risk individuals while continuing to seek absconders and to make sure that public safety needs within the agency and the communities are met. And the last major staffing restructure that occurred here was at the New Mexico Corrections Training Academy. And what we did was we had to make some pretty significant changes in their internal structure in order to maximize people that had specialty training, certifications, and we also wanted to increase the satellite academies that are available throughout the state. At one point, we were only conducting maybe one satellite academy per year, and this really was hurting our recruitment in areas outside of the Santa Fe and Albuquerque area. So there was a lot of a push to make sure that we were able to improve recruitment and also to make sure that we were specializing training for supervisors and different staff at specific levels and being able to make offerings to really specific positions, like developing a class that was solely focused on classification officers, another class that was specifically focused on records training, and then we of course split the academy training sessions. So it would be probation and parole officers would have one academy and correctional officers would have a separate academy. Now, in our training academy, we really have been focused on making some policy changes. And what we did was I believe it was the month of March, we published some training changes that altered the way that we recruit people. So before, we used to have these really, really strict guidelines in order for a person to begin training with us. And what we found was that this was leading to a really specific type of an individual, and it really wasn't opening ourselves up to recruit a wide variety of applicants. And we figured, how can we focus on bringing in the people that we know do well in correctional environments? People with life experience, people who have skills that are capable of doing things like diffusing situations and talking people down. So we changed the way that you enter into our academy. Rather than coming in and conducting this major physical assessment, and that's the only way that you get in, we now have our new recruits bring to us a clearance from their medical provider that indicates that they will be able to undergo training. And then it's given us the opportunity to actually teach people and to get them through physical conditioning, teach them about fitness, nutrition, and help them get to the place where they can pass those requirements, which are still required in order to graduate from our academy. Our curriculum has changed quite a bit as well. We now have a really extreme focus on things like communication tools, professionalism, officer safety, and what that really means is that we're making offerings now for, and actually we're making it mandatory for all of our correctional officers and probation officers to undergo things like mental health first aid courses. They have to go through motivational interviewing courses, and they really spend a lot of time focusing on how to effectively communicate and diffuse situations. And of course, they do still engage in all of the other components of the training, but we shortened the length of some curriculum and then increased the amount of communication courses that are included in the academy. We've also changed our recruitment efforts very significantly. We're now offering virtual interviews, but one of the main things that's made a big difference in the way that we recruit is that we have location-specific screening. And that location-specific screening has just made a world of difference when it comes to us being able to bring people into our agency from other areas. In the past, we were finding that our agency was only allowing screening to take place one time per week in the middle of the week, which was leading then to people from outlying areas in the community or people who lived at a great distance to incur significant cost and figure out a way to stay here because the entry screening process took 2 days. And so if you were coming from a place like Hobbs or Las Cruces, you absolutely had to figure out a way to lodge overnight here. And now we're able to do the screening protocol at each individual location to make sure that we're able to bring in more people. So when I go through the training academy, there's a couple of items that I want to just make you all aware of because they were just really significant. So far for the year 2020, there have been 158 cadets that have graduated from our academy. The graduation rate is now at 92%. And then between September and December of this year, we anticipate graduating an additional 97 cadets that are active or scheduled to become active in classes in these coming months. Throughout the year 2016, there have been 10 academies conducted. 6 of them have been full corrections academies, and 4 of them have been what are referred to as CBW courses. And these courses are made available to people who previously had certification to work in a corrections institution, but have been away from the job for 2 years or longer. And there have been 4 of those CBW courses. 3 of them have taken place or 3 full academies have taken place at our training academy in Santa Fe. And then 3 have taken place at satellite locations. Los Lunas, Roswell, and Springer all saw full academies. And with those CBW courses, 2 of them were held at the training academy in Santa Fe, and then 2 satellite courses were held at the Western New Mexico Correctional Facility in Grants area. And in total, again, 158 graduates have completed the academy during the year of 2020. In 2019, for comparison, there were a total of 126 graduates from the academy throughout the entire year. Now, as we're looking ahead, we do have additional academies that are being prepared to be scheduled, and we already have people enrolled in all of these courses. We have satellite academies that are getting ready to take place in Hobbs, in Grants, Las Cruces, Springer, and Clayton, and also here at our main training academy. And then we have one or CBW course that's taking place at our main academy. All of this in the coming months. The reentry division. Now, the main thing was that this area needed to become something more significant than what it was in previous times, really. It was a bureau. It was the Recidivism Reduction and Reentry Bureau. And overall, really spent a lot of time dealing with education efforts and did not go too far into other areas like program development, figuring out ways to help people prepare for release. And there was no direct communication or linkage, rather, between the work that was being done in the facilities and the work that was being done in the field. So the goal of the Reentry Division as it is established is to holistically approach every aspect of personal development, transition planning, and successful outcomes for incarcerated people and all of the individuals that are on supervision with us. So what we're doing is exploring and implementing transition planning best practices. And really what that means is our Compass assessment tool, which we've talked about quite a bit in prior committees, had been implemented in our probation and parole field offices to a much greater degree than it had been implemented at our facility level or at our facilities. And we found that there were a lot of different issues that were involved in that process. And we wanted to figure out ways to just knock down all of those barriers and make sure that we were able to make best use of the Compass assessment tool. That tool helps us to create transition plans for people, and it helps us identify what each individual person's needs are, whether it be resources, post-release, housing, treatment needs, and other things that would benefit the person as they are moving through that transition process from leaving an institution and becoming successful out in the community. And first thing that was really glaring was that there really wasn't a whole lot of interaction between facilities and field offices. So they've actually taken some staff members and some duties out of both the Adult Prisons Division area and the Probation and Parole offices in order to create this new reentry division. Now, these folks are going to work with people who are getting out. The first thing they're going to do is get that assessment, that Compass assessment completed on the person, and then they're going to start working with them on where they intend to go, what their resources are in that community, and the goal is to figure out how to get all of those services in place before that person leaves the institution. And that way, when they get out, they have a greater chance of success. There's also quite a lot of peer mentorship that's involved in that process. And there's several peer mentoring aspects of the Bureau that are in effect that I'll go over in just a bit. But the one I want to really emphasize here is that we're working right now with Project ECHO. We've already been doing work with them for quite some time. And what they do is they create a training curriculum and peer-to-peer mentorship support. We're working right now to bring some folks on board who have been incarcerated previously so that they can help walk people who are releasing from institutions through that process of what they've been through. There are staff members that, and we're actually working also with the New Mexico Department of Health to get some people trained as certified peer support workers and hoping that they will be able to find employment with that certification when they get out, and possibly with us as they help to work or as they help to ease people through that transition process when they get back out into the communities from years or months of incarceration, whatever their length of sentence was. So when you see that section there about identifying gaps in services, that could mean a whole variety of different things. It could mean things like a person who has received some substance use disorder treatment while they're incarcerated, but still require more. We want to make sure that we identify that before they get out and set them up with counselors and service providers in the community. People who need assistance with finding work. We want to make sure that we're able to provide them a guiding hand and somebody to help walk them through the process of applications, working with the Department of Workforce Solutions, and communicating with the employers out there about all of the benefits that are available. For example, there's a federal bonding program that provides insurance for some employers who choose to hire people that have felony convictions. And there are other things like tax credits that are available for employers who hire people who are releasing from incarceration. And we want to make sure that we do some outreach to community, to employers, to make sure that people are aware of those options for releasing people. Now, it's important to know that this division is in the early stages of its development, and it is also focusing on expanding programming opportunities within all of the institutions, and they're emphasizing programs that are going to help people develop viable job skills. We have procured, or through our budget opportunities last year, we were given the funds to be able to purchase some heavy equipment operation simulators. They are actually being set up right now at 2 locations, and those simulators, they are mobile, so they will be made available to all people in all institutions throughout the state. And we're exploring also partnerships with local colleges to explore areas of study like culinary arts, automotive repair, and obtaining CDL certifications. And it looks like we are making quite a lot of progress in at least the culinary areas, and the culinary and the auto repair. And at this time, with everything that's been going on with the pandemic, there's still some barriers that we're working through to get CDL training to happen inside of our institutions via simulator, and bringing those folks in to train our inmate populations, and also to train institutional staff members to be able to provide that service and have it lead to a legitimate certification. I mentioned this just briefly before, but we did also bring the volunteer services and the religious services directly under the reentry division. And what that really has done is it's placed a new energy on the people that are providing that service. It's definitely been complicated to navigate through this new world, as we have not, we're not able to bring people into institutions to the degree that we used to. Right now, the only people that are able to enter into institutions are the people that are determined to be essential staff members. So security personnel, teachers, behavioral health providers, classification officers, they're all coming into the institution today, and there haven't been any interruptions to service there. But when we did at one point in time have a very robust volunteer group, and they would come into all of our institutions. And so we've just had to figure out different ways to make that happen still. And through the reentry division, we also purchased some just small little cameras to attach to all of the classification officers and unit managers' computers, so that they will be able to set up these reentry meetings, probation and parole hearings pre-release. And then they're also using that equipment to hold NA and AA meetings with volunteer groups. And there have been also some religious groups that have conducted some courses with us at certain facilities over video. And we're preparing to start what they call, it's a program called AVP, the Alternatives to Violence, which will be made available in 2 institutions to begin with. We had just been having to figure out the way that we were going to do that via video platform. There's quite a lot of information on peer support and what we've done in the institution. I'll be happy to answer questions about that, but I also will send you all some additional information. But just to go over it very, very quickly, we have peer support workers in our RDAP program, which is through the Behavioral Health Department. But because the reentry division now is firmly rooted within portions of adult prisons operations, they are able to directly link and work with the Behavioral Health Bureau to make sure that programs that they're instituting will have an impact on successful release and reentry. Also through the behavioral health collaboration and with DOH is how we've worked on that peer support program. So far, 7 people have been trained and certified officially through the Department of Health as certified peer support workers. Our chaplains also are involved in peer support work, and there are several inmates throughout the state. The total is 50 certified workers that go throughout facilities. These are inmates, and they complete the coursework at the Hobbs facility in the seminary program, and then they're sent out to other facilities where they live, but they also provide ministry and spiritual support to their fellow inmates. And then lots of work with the University of New Mexico's ECHO program, and we hope to expand that in the future. In the year of 2020, there have been 27 peer educators trained, and 716 students have attended these peer-to-peer workshops put on through ECHO. Our corrections industries is another area that I had talked about quite a bit as when I first entered into this role. I discovered that it was maybe just a few people that were really struggling to try to make these businesses stay afloat. We've brought in this gentleman, Robert Leon. He comes to us from North Carolina with years and years of experience in corrections industries. And at this point in time, we now have 5 active operations. They're in Los Lunas, Santa Rosa, and there are 2 in Grants. One is at the Women's Facility Western, and the other one is at the Core Civic Facility, which is referred to as the Northwest New Mexico Detention Facility. And as you can see here, they provide a variety of different services. They're working right now, Industries is working on business plans to expand in Roswell, Springer, and Las Cruces. And they're in the process of research and development stages to create more positions for inmates. And the goal will be to work directly with the reentry division to make sure that whatever they bring in has educational components and certifications where that's relevant. And you see some of the areas that we're looking at doing that with right here. And all of these areas are things that would lead to work post-release as well. And that's another item that's of significant note. Now, this is some information you all are already familiar with, but I provided you with the map of the institutions throughout the state, the adult prisons facility map. You see the 7 publicly operated institutions and the 4 privately operated institutions and where they're at located throughout the state. This next slide is really the same information, but with a little bit more detail. You see a list of all the publicly operated facilities, and I include the location, the capacity at each location, the count, that count is from today, and the same information for the privately operated and state contracted institutions. Our total capacity is 7,938, and the count today is 6,095 people. Now this next slide here shows the probation and parole region map. And as you can see on your agenda, Director Melanie Martinez will be speaking shortly, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here. I'm going to let her cover all of the areas of probation and parole. But we have, as you can see here, we have the 5 probation and parole region offices, and within these region offices, there are 46 district offices that are in operations and supervise people on probation and parole throughout the state. Now, this is something I wouldn't typically include in a presentation here, but at the last meeting of the subcommittee, there was some vocalization that this group was interested in hearing some information about our budget. And our budget, we are doing 2 presentations later this year, and I've included the dates of those presentations on the next slide for your information, but I'm just going to go ahead and give you a brief overview of what our budget system or situation looks like. So our budget is, it includes 4 budget program areas. They're referred to as IMAC, COM, program support, and then CI. Under IMAC, it's our largest area. As you can see here, our FY21 total operating budget was $299.2 million essentially. This is responsible for the operation of all 11 institutions, the private and the public, and it includes a variety of things, including medical care, behavioral health services, food service, education, classification services, STIU specialists in facilities, records management, uniforms, bedding, supplies, equipment. All of these things are part of that IMAC budget. It's why it is the largest area of our operating budget. The community offender management area is where probation and parole falls. And you can see that number there, which is from our total operating budget in FY21. And probation and parole really includes everything that goes along with it, from community behavioral health services to housing assistance, helping people with basic needs, including transportation, rental assistance, food, clothing, clothing vouchers, and also officer uniforms and all of the other basic needs of the staff members that work in that area. Program support is all encompassing of all of our administrative services within the administration of the agency. That includes the Administrative Services Division with the Budget Bureau, and procurement offices, information technology, our general counsel, the Office of the Inspector General, our public relations offices, and also includes the training academy. And then finally, Corrections Industries, it's an enterprise fund, so it's not at all funded by the general fund, and it operates very much like a business. The goal of the Corrections Industries Department is to enhance educational and vocational skills for inmates through productive involvement in enterprise and public works of benefit to state agencies and local public bodies. Now, these two dates here are our upcoming presentations to the Legislative Finance Committee. Because of the size of our agency and our budget, I have to figure out how to go back. There we go. We do two hearings. We do a preview hearing that takes place on October 28th. I don't have a time scheduled for that yet, but as soon as I have it, I'll make sure that all of this committee receives that information. And then we do our full budget request finalized on December 7th before the Legislative Finance Committee. And during that time is when we are making our request for the FY22 budget. The next thing I'm going to go into is just to give you all a brief overview of our efforts during the situation with COVID-19 in our state. So first and foremost, there's a lot of proactive and preventive measures that we've taken throughout this process. First of all, we limited entry, and this happened immediately when the first case of the first positive case was identified in the state of New Mexico. We limited our entry to essential staff members only. As the pandemic moved forward and we've learned more about the process, we started to make sure that everybody was wearing face masks and face coverings. So all of our staff members are mandated, required to wear face masks, and all of our inmate population are also wearing face masks. Initially, we provided every inmate with 2 cloth face masks, and our officers were also provided with 2 cloth face masks. And as we've moved forward through the process, of course, we have made additional personal protective equipment available to all staff members in all of our institutions everywhere. In all of our institutions, the high-touch surfaces are sanitized regularly. There's a lot of specialty equipment that's being used to make sure that areas are sanitized with proper equipment and chemicals that aren't harmful to people, but that kill the high percentages of germs. We also made sure that a lot of information was posted everywhere to give people information about what exactly is COVID-19. To the degree that we know, we take the posters from the Department of Health's website and we post them all over our institutions everywhere, in living quarters, common areas, and it really gives people an overview about COVID-19, proper hand washing and hygiene. And then moving on from the hygiene, we've also made sure that all of the issuance for sanitation and hygiene products for our inmate populations were doubled. And in some cases, it's provided more frequently. It just really depends on what the inmates' needs are. But if the needs are increased, then we make sure that they are provided with whatever equipment or products that they need to make sure that they're safe and their areas and themselves are able to be properly sanitized and kept clean. We've also been able to institute social distancing in our institutions. We've mandated it through all of our facilities. This is complicated. It can be complicated because every facility is really different the way that they're made up. Some facilities have individual cells, some have double cells, some of them are dormitory areas, and in all cases, there are large common areas. So what we've done is we've cut the amounts of people that are able to be in areas at a given time. So an example is at one of our larger facilities like Northeast, for example, where we have perhaps 60 people that live in the dormitory. They live on what's called the top tier and the bottom tier. And so when they come out in groups to interact and spend time together, we only send half the group out at a time. So we don't send all 60 out, we send half of the group. We mandate that tables are at half capacity and that people are maintaining distance to the extent possible. And whenever an inmate is in a common area, they are required to wear their face covering as well. This also has applied to things like eating in cafeteria. So instead of an entire unit, I'll give an example, like in a level 2 facility, for example, you have 3 pods that make up one housing unit. So at one time, we used to send all of the pods to the dining hall at the same time. Now we only send one pod at a time to the dining hall. We wait until that group is done, and then we sanitize the area and then call for the next pod. Everything definitely takes longer, but it is the best way to ensure that we are creating this social distancing opportunities to the extent that we're able to in these common living areas. Now, all people that enter into our facilities and any of our offices have to be screened medically. So we ask them a series of questions, and everybody gets temperature scanned in all locations. This also was started at the very early days, during the very early days of the pandemic, and it has continued to this day, where we continue to temperature screen everybody and medically screen people as they walk into our institutions. And then staff that are working in the isolation and medical quarantine units, they never work in another area. So if a staff member works in an area where there's a positive inmate, they don't also go and conduct a unit check in an area where there are negative inmates. And that's because they're fully wearing all of the personal protective equipment, and we don't want to take any risk whatsoever that there will be cross-contamination from one housing unit into another. Now, inmate services during the pandemic, lots of things have had to be moved over to video services. We are a state that really doesn't have a whole lot of active technology or technological capabilities, but we worked really hard with our IT team, and they were able to figure out a way to provide visitation for families to meet via video. This is all taking place on a Zoom platform. There's no cost to family members. They schedule the visit through their classification officer, and we send them a link. They show up to the visit, and these visits are available in every single one of our institutions. We've also brought some volunteer services online through video services. Now, what this looks like, and the same holds true for some of the peer education courses, is that, so we have these, in our education classrooms, we have these large Promethean boards, and we're able to set those up to function like a computer monitor, so that the interaction between the participants and the teachers can be interactive. So the people who put on like the NA volunteer groups, for example, they'll come in, they'll hold their meeting. We set up a gymnasium or a large area where people can spread out, and we make sure that the sound is functional. We'll bring in the group of inmates that want to participate in that group, and then they can actually interact with the people on the other side of the screen. It has definitely been complicated, but it seems to be something that is going to help drive us in a new direction, and perhaps be able to increase the number of these types of services that we're able to provide, and be able to provide them to larger numbers of incarcerated people. Parole board hearings are also taking place via video. This has been actually very helpful. It's streamlined the process. So the way that it used to work was that a parole board hearing would only be scheduled once a month at a given institution on a specific day with a specific number of people. Now we're able to conduct hearings every week with people from different institutions, which helps us really focus on people's release date and make sure that nobody falls through the cracks and misses a parole board hearing. And with part of the reentry division, part of their goal will be to begin conducting release planning via video. And the goal there is to make sure that before a person gets out of an institution, they are able to meet their supervising probation and parole officer, and also spend some time with some reentry specialists who will help talk them through the procedures and plans that they are about to enter into when they release into the community. We've added some no-cost phone access for all of our inmate populations, and there has been no interruption in service at all for things like behavioral health and medical services, education, and pre-release planning, and access to classification and records. Now, this chart just shows you what our status is by facility, and that first line, that dark gray line, is the total capacity for that individual institution. And then the next one is what the current population is, and that's today's population count. And then the the colors, what you'll see there is the red orange color that shows you the number of current active cases right now, positive cases in that institution. And the green number shows you the number of cases from that institution that have recovered. And then the blue will indicate if there have been any deaths due to the virus in our institutions. And so what you see there for Los Lunas is that we have 5 active positive cases right now. And in Hobbs, there are 2 active cases right now. There are no active cases at any other institutions at this time. Our tests and results. In total, we've conducted 25,066 tests. Of those, 11,840 have been on staff, 13,226 on inmates. As I mentioned in that prior slide, there are 7 active inmate cases right now. There are also 24 active staff cases at this present time. Recoveries, though, we have 66 staff members that have shown recovery. This is done by double negative testing, and 503 inmate recoveries. In general, with our testing for staff, we're testing 50% of facility staff every week. We're also conducting contact tracing, and whenever a rapid response is needed, we test at 100% staff and inmates. And in the inmate testing, we're testing 100% of intake. So every single intake is tested, and they're placed in medical quarantine for a 14-day period. And then we're also testing 100% of our releasing inmates. So anybody who's releasing will be released with their test results. The hope here, the goal here was to make sure that people who were releasing would not be going out into communities with positive test results. Thus far, we have not had an individual who has released with a positive case, but we have been working really hard with a lot of different communities to locate non-congregate COVID-specific housing for positive cases that are releasing in the event that it does happen. All of our releasing inmates are also leaving with an information packet, giving them detail on where the testing sites are occurring, and local information to Department of Health offices in their community of departure. We also test among inmates for rapid response, and then anytime our medical staff recommend that an individual be tested, then we will conduct an additional test. And with that, I will stand for questions.
Thank you very much, Secretary Tafoya Lucero. I think I'm afraid if I start questions right now, we might never finish. But what I was going to suggest is that we go ahead and do the probation and parole. Are you available to stay?
I am.
Okay, I was thinking if we had, well, you're presenting with Ms. Martinez, and if we did probation and parole now, and then we'll have the discussion of the probation parole issues separately, but we'll do the questions after Ms. Martinez. I think that's after the two of you do that together. So if you want to go ahead and do your presentation on probation parole, and because those are pretty integral to the corrections presentation, I think that's how I'd like to do it.
That sounds good, Madam Chair. I'm going to pull up the probation and parole PowerPoint, and then I'm going to put my mask on and get out of the way.
And members, I just want you to know I am keeping a list. Right now, the only one I have on the list is Senator O'Neill. So be sure to let me know. You know, you go to the participants and you click on that, and then you can click on the hand at the bottom, and then that will show that you wish to speak or ask a question.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Melanie Martinez. I'm the Director of Adult Probation Parole. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present on the probation parole update. Madam Chair, if you don't mind just giving me the thumbs up that you can hear me okay. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you fine. We can hear you. Sorry.
I'll go ahead and get started by introducing my management team. So if you notice, Region 1 is highlighted in the light blue section, and my Region 1 manager is Lavriana Belmontes. Region 2 is the Albuquerque area, and it's split up into 2 regions. So Cheryl Hobbs supervises the standard supervision along with the Valencia County District Office. Carl Wilkin is our region manager of special programs, which includes our sex offender unit, intensive supervision, community corrections, along with the Rio Rancho and Bernalillo offices. Region 3 is the southwest part of the region that's run by Stephanie Vincenti. And Region 4 is highlighted in the pink area. And Susan Palter is the region manager in that area. At the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see Haven Scoggin. She's our community corrections administrator. Haven's tasked with oversight of our behavioral health contracts. And her and her team also do audits quarterly to determine if the programs providing services in our state are actually providing the services that we requested. Roberta Cohen is our New Mexico Interstate Compact Administrator. So any individual who's placed on probation parole who wants to transfer out of state or who wants to transfer in state, her team is tasked with determining if they meet the criteria for transfer. She's also tasked with any transports of inmates or individuals who are in custody out of state, bringing them back into New Mexico. So not on the photo, not on the slide is my Deputy Director of STIU, which is Paul Pacheco. And I'll get into that a little bit later in my presentation. So currently we have a population of 15,321 individuals on probation, parole, or dual supervision. We also have 1,700 individuals who are declared absconders, and we've recently gone through that list and we've separated them by violent versus nonviolent absconders. So that looks more like 600 individuals who have some sort of violent component that are current absconders, and 1,100 who are considered nonviolent. I know our average caseload has gone down the last couple of years, and basically using Albuquerque as an example for standard supervision, our average caseload is roughly about 65 offenders for standard supervision. And for those of you who know special programs, we try to keep caseloads for sex offenders less than 25 per officer. Intensive supervision, we don't have any more than 35 per officer, and sex offenders is usually anywhere in the range of 20 to 25. High-risk offenders, those caseloads can go up to 50 per officer. So I know average across the state, our caseloads were about 79 per officer for standard caseloads. And contributing to that are some vacancies throughout the state that we've been trying to fill that are hard to fill areas, and we've been unsuccessful. So I'm going to move on to the Community Corrections Administration. Right now, last year we increased our contracted behavioral health providers by double. So right now we have 20 contracted housing and behavioral health providers. Our FY21 budget is $7,433,886. And we provide services to over 15,000 individuals statewide. So I guess basically anyone who walks in the door who's placed on any type of probation parole supervision, they are referred for an assessment by their officer. And basically the assessment tells us what type of programming they need. You know, sometimes you'll see in judgment and sentences where inpatient's required. And when we send them for assessments, actually intensive outpatient. So we follow any recommendations from the assessment and the treatment provider. So we average about 570 clients housed monthly, and this is starting from January 2020 through current. So inpatient treatment, we had about 233 per month, transitional living about 212, halfway house about 125. So that's an average of 570 clients housed monthly throughout the state. So like I said earlier, every individual who is placed on any type of supervision is referred for some sort of counseling, substance abuse, any type of treatment. And averaging from January through current, we've averaged about 152 referrals for contracted counseling services, average of 1,394 attending each month with a contracted counselor provider. And the length of services varies. It varies from 30, 60, 90 days up to 3 years. And at the bottom, you'll see an average of 60 successful program completions monthly. So the next slide actually covers what type of services we provided through January through current. And as you notice, our rent assistance is probably the highest. I'm going to go over that when I cover my COVID-19 slide. But over the last 3 months, we have provided additional assistance for rental assistance, utility, food hygiene, transportation, and vital records. And I know the topic of intakes has come up in the past, and basically seems like our intakes for probation parole, specifically for probation, has been lower than usual. So I identified per region what that looks like. So for Region 1, our total up to date is 662. Region 2 is usually double of what it is, and it's at a little over 1,000. And Region 3 is average about 500. And Region 4 is about a little over 600. So this is anyone who's sentenced to probation. All right. This slide covers any sanctions and evidence-based practice utilized prior to revocation or arrest. So I'm not going to go through every single bullet point, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that come up. But basically, we try to do diversion, which is, increased level of supervision, GPS, more frequent drug testing, community service, alcohol monitoring if necessary. Sometimes we get to the point where we actually make individuals write down their conditions, and so they're familiar with their conditions, they can repeat the conditions, they know what's expected of them. AA, NA meetings, Gamblers Anonymous if appropriate. Veterans Court is specific to that population, along with drug court, mental health, and treatment court. So these are just some of the sanctions or alternatives that we provide prior to revocation. Okay, so we actually broke it out by how many offenders not in custody pending revocation. And again, I'll get into this a little bit more when my COVID-19 slide, but basically it looks like 34% have been released prior to revocation. Some sort of house arrest has been imposed, GPS and a criminal summons, and other is basically, maybe the PV was dismissed or they were just continued on supervision. All right, the next slide covers our sex offender population. And the reason why this is important to understand is that majority of our sex offenders who are returned to prison usually are arrested on new charges. However, since the charges may take time, they admit to some sort of technical violation. And so looking at our returns to prison, it looks like they're only returned on technicals. However, as you know, I'll go to the next slide. So you can see that there's the sex offender behavioral health contract violation. There's also other standard conditions that they violate. Some of them abscond, and the blue highlights new charges. So I think it's important to know that just because they admit to a technical violation. Majority of the time they're arrested on new charges. It's just, probation parole, we don't have control over if someone's prosecuted or not. So let me go back real quick. Briefly, I want to mention that last year we implemented what's called the Static 99, and that's an assessment tool specific to our sex offender population. So anytime anyone is placed on supervision, whether it's probation, parole, this assessment is specific to the sex offender population. If they violate, same thing. This is specific to their crimes. So as Secretary Tafoya Lucero mentioned earlier, our focus on COMPAS, we actually have every single individual within 45 days of their supervision who completes the COMPAS assessment tool. And that's where the referrals and the case plan is created. All right, I'll talk briefly about our fugitive apprehension team. Like I mentioned earlier, we have over 1,700 absconders. In the past year, we've had about 350 arrested by our STIU officers, our fugitive apprehension group. 1,619 were arrested by other law enforcement agencies. So I know doing the math, it doesn't add up, right? Why do we still have 1,700 still identified as absconders? So just because, when they're arrested, they're reinstated, then they abscond again. So we're trying to figure out alternatives. And the secretary mentioned that she placed STIU under probation parole division, and that's where we separated violent versus nonviolent. And we actually are going to reassign those nonviolent absconders back to the division or the district offices. And we're going to try to come up with alternatives, whether it's them turning themselves in, coming up with some sort of plan with our judicial partners, trying to get them a hearing, and whether it's reinstating them, continuing them on supervision as long as they're not arrested or pose a danger to the community. But we're trying to solution it so we don't have 1,700 absconders throughout the state. Total absconders arrested for 2020 is 1,970. All right, COVID-19 in probation parole. I know the secretary covered majority of what we've done at a high level, but as far as probation parole, we met in March with Secretary Tafoya Lucero, and we met with the region managers. And what I tasked the region managers with was I wanted them to review all detention logs and their arrest and hold logs. And I wanted them to work with their judicial partners, and I wanted them to work with their criminal justice partners to determine anyone who was completing some sort of detention sanctions, anyone who was completing some sort of sentence on a probation violation, anyone who's going to be continued or reinstated on probation, how we can make recommendations to the judge to release them as soon as we had the public health order. So they worked with their judicial partners, district attorneys, defense attorneys, and they made recommendations to reinstate, continue, and release back on supervision. As long as they didn't pose a danger to themselves, the community, and had a valid approved residence. So we also worked with the courts to set up virtual court hearings for officers. Anyone who was arrested on new charges that was a parolee or dual, we transported them directly to RDC, which is in Los Lunas, or Grants for Women. And we set up hearings through the facilities to get them within their timelines for their violations. As far as operations, initially we had to educate ourselves on what the pandemic was. We had to educate our officers, and in turn, they had to educate the population. So as you all aware, that caused increased anxiety, stress, and we had to teach them how to balance both their professional lives as well as their personal lives. So we transitioned to what's called the virtual check-ins, which is done through FaceTime or WhatsApp. And we also do curbside field check-ins, keeping a minimum of 10 feet distance between ourselves and the population when checking in. All officers are required to use PPE. We use protective gear to begin with. But again, masks was an adjustment for all officers. Usually we only use them during the flu season or if we're doing some sort of hospital watch. And now it was more of a daily thing. And so all officers were fitted with the N95 masks. They were given shields. And one thing I refused is we were going to send them in with hazmat suits. So until we learned more about how this virus was transmitted and how we can make this work and how we can adjust to the new COVID world, we had to get everything in line prior to sending them out in the field. Right now we have drive-up drug testing, which is a no-contact saliva testing. GPS placement and removal is done either in an open area or in a lobby with only one individual attending. So briefly, with Interstate Compact, we suspended any incoming transfers as well as outgoing transfers until we could figure out how to make this work. It was a 30-day suspension of all transfers, and once we sat down with the Interstate Compact Commission and figured out how we could work around COVID, that has since changed, and we are allowing individuals to transfer in and out of state. So training of our probation parole officers in the COVID world, we've had to adjust our training to virtual, except for defensive tactics, taser, and our firearms. We've had to narrow it down to small pods, which is, in the beginning, it was only a 5-to-1, so 5 per 1 instructor, and now we've increased that to 10 officers per 1 instructor. And I think that Secretary Taforia Lucera mentioned the academy, and for the Probation Parole Basic Academy, anyone who's within the Santa Fe or Albuquerque area attends in person, and all other surrounding areas attends virtually. So the only time they will actually have to come on site will be the last 2 weeks of the academy to, again, like I said, they have to do physical contact or some sort of defensive tactics testing to test out. So programs, what happened to our programs, inpatient programs that we work with with COVID? So each program comes up with their emergency response. They sent it to management for approval, but we do have emergency plans in place for the New Mexico Men's and Women's Recovery Academy, for the pavilions, for Transitional for Living, and La Posada. They monitor all the clients that, and it's in line with Department of Health requirements. So they monitor temperature checks. They ask them if they're, all the questions that Department of Health has in place. We also have alternative placement if anyone has tested positive in one of those facilities. So, like I said earlier, the services we provided increased the last couple of months. And when I say the services for rental assistance, vital records, housing, hygiene, food, clothes, all of the above, we've had to help our offender population. They had to figure out how to pay their rent. They had to figure out how to balance, paying their rent and buying their family food. So the Community Corrections Administration really stepped up. The region managers really stepped up, and we figured out a way how to help them with these concerns. So this slide is reflecting since March 2020. So basically what probation parole officers were tasked with was anyone who's completed half of their probation sentence, anyone who has completed all of their requirements, anyone who has complied with everything, and basically all they're doing is paying their probation parole fee. We requested an early discharge. So right at the top, you'll see the satisfactory discharges throughout the state. Unsatisfactory, that's basically someone who was pending a violation and maybe admitted to the violation and was given an unsat by the judge. early releases, and then other covers like deaths. So there was a small percentage that we closed out based on death.
Ms. Martinez, would you tell us which ones are which? Because I'm having trouble distinguishing between the shades of red. So were there 57% satisfactory? Is that how it goes?
Yes,
Or
50%. I apologize. 57% satisfactory, 32% unsatisfactory, 3% early, and 8% other.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So I mean, I'm very grateful for not only my management team, the leadership of Secretary Teforia Lucero, but my officers, my supervisors, hearing officers, region managers, fugitive apprehension officers, because they understand that during this time, we have to be creative, we have to be flexible, and we just have to figure out how to, we're essential. So we have to figure out how to make it work in this COVID world. And they have, they're very creative, they're very open. You know, as you all know, in March, we thought it was, you know, operations was going to be one thing. And by the weekend through Monday, it changed. So these officers have adjusted. They've you know, made great strides to reach out to all of their population, to educate them, to help them. And I'm very grateful for that. So that concludes my presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Teforia Lucero for questions.
Before we go to questions from the committee, I wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, we have two LFC staff members we asked to join us today, Ellen Rabin and Amanda Dick Petty, and they know the corrections budget very, very well. So they're here and can, members can address questions to them as well. They're in the panel now. And we've been joined also by Senator O'Neill and Senator Candelaria this afternoon. And what I wanted to mention is that when the screen sharing goes away, if you want to reference the handouts, the PowerPoints, they're on the website under, there's a handout for our committee today, and each of them is separately labeled and available to you there if you want to look, if you're wanting to look at a particular slide when it's not up on the screen anymore. The first person I have on my list for this, for the Corrections Department and Probation Parole is Senator O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary and Melanie. I wanted to say to the Secretary, I really appreciate your emphasis on re-entry. That really comes through, because we talk all the time. How do we cut into the alarming rate of recidivism that is endemic to New Mexico and nationally as well? So thank you so much for that emphasis, and really look forward to working with you. Looking forward here, moving forward, as they say. But I do have a question. You know, we had well, in the spirit of, you know, talking about recidivism, we did have a presentation from Dismas House recently. You know, that's run by HopeWorks now. It's just such a great program. And we were very concerned that the funding, in a time where, you know, where reentry is so important, and in a time where you're under some pressure, I would assume, to release people because of COVID, very concerned about a dramatic cut in funding for Dismas House. I believe almost half of their budget. And I don't understand that, honestly. Many of us don't, because they're able to do full capacity. They haven't relinquished any of their capacity, you know, with 16 women, and I'm not sure how many men at their men's facility. So could you explain to me the rationale for reducing the funding for Dismas House?
Madam Chair and Senator O'Neill, thank you for the question. So I'll have to look specifically at the Dismas House and what their budget looks like. But I mean, I will say that in dealing with our budget moving forward and figuring out what our request was going to be, we definitely were in a situation, are in a situation where we do have to cut certain aspects of the budget. So one of the areas that I know where we cut some beds at was at the, what's it called? La Posada. It's a federal halfway house, and we house a lot of people, or, you know, a few people there. We have some beds there. We did cut some of the beds there. And the reason really was because we were having some difficulty with them choosing to approve people or not approve people. And that's one of the things that we actually see quite a lot when we're working with a lot of these halfway houses, is that they are the ones that set the criteria for who gets out or who can go to their location, and they're the ones that tell us who they will accept. And in most situations, most halfway houses won't accept somebody with any kind of gang affiliation that's considered significant. They won't accept people with violent charges. And I remember the last time I came upon any halfway house at all that was willing to take somebody who was on any type of medication, be it for a behavioral health need or a medical need. That's often one of the main limiting areas that will prevent a person from being able to go out into a halfway house. So I'll have to look specifically at that dismiss situation, because I'm not familiar with us choosing to cut them to that degree. I will be happy to get back with you on that.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. But as a former employee of Dismiss House way back when, that isn't an issue for this program. They have not had a problem with filling their beds, filling their facility. And again, we're talking about, a decrease in half of their funding, and it's not a budget buster by any means. I think it's 200 and something in a normal period of time. They don't have any of those. They're actually in attendance today if they wanted to weigh in, but they don't have those issues that you just reeled off. They don't. So it's really of concern, because, we want to cut into recidivism, and it's just something that, for a variety of reasons, it just was really surprising to many of us on the committee. But I hear you loud and clear, and you can't know everything about these different programs. So, and again, really looking forward to working with you in the future. But I do have a question for Ms. Martinez, and thank you for your answer on that.
Senator O'Neill, let me just be sure, that the secretary will get back to you through the committee, through Elizabeth Johnson. Okay? Okay,
sounds good.
All right, thank you. Okay.
And then, also with Ms. Martinez, that's so interesting with the 1,700 absconders. That's a lot of people. Those are a lot of folks that have absconded from their parole. Is that the number, like, currently?
Yes, that's the number currently.
Holy moly.
So again, and I had my management team break it down. So out of the 1,700, we broke it down to violent versus nonviolent. And we really want to work with those nonviolent offenders as long as they're not committing new crimes and they're not wanted for other new crimes. So we want to, like I said, we want to get creative. We want to, whether put them on a docket to have a hearing, to reinstate them on supervision. But yes, it is at 1,700.
So I'm curious, Madam Chair, Melanie, how do you define violent absconders versus nonviolent absconders? What criteria do you use?
Madam Chair, members of the committee. So basically anyone with a violent component would be committing a crime with a weapon, some sort of aggravated component. A nonviolent crime would be, like a possession charge or something that doesn't deal with a weapon.
Okay, thank you. And then, I'm sure you're aware that we talk a lot on this committee and in our subcommittee on criminal justice reform, what to do about the technical parole violators. They take this huge chunk of our corrections budget. Other states have been creative with how to hold parolees accountable at the same time, not unnecessarily reincarcerating them at great expense. So, just know that we're really looking at that issue, and I really like your emphasis on technical parole violators. It's a real problem, and I know we can do better, and I'm really looking forward again to working with you as well, and just be advised. We're talking about that a lot on this policy level, and will be during the full session. But thank you for the update on parole. And how are the caseloads finally these days? Are the parole officers able to hang in there with their caseloads?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, yes, they are able to, and I have to give credit to Compass. The assessment tool really focuses on individuals who need to be on supervision, and really focuses on individuals who can do things on their own. So we're only supervising individuals that actually need to be supervised. But I'm going to backtrack real quick on the programs. I mentioned in my presentation that we were able to increase for rental assistance because at the time COVID happened and everyone transitioned to telemed, some of the funding that was allocated for these programs were dispersed elsewhere. So I think you mentioned the program vetting for the Dismas House, and the Secretary Tafoya Lucero brought up La Posada. We were able to increase the beds at La Posada just because treatment providers that we had contracted with weren't going to use the funding during that time. So that's why we were able to increase the beds. I'll look into the Dismas and I'll stop it with Secretary Tafoya Lucero and we'll get you an answer.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you both. And that's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Next, I have Senator Cedillo Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate those comprehensive presentations. But this is something that I've talked about before. The confusion I have between the private prisons, because and the corrections department and the relationship between them, because what you described about the COVID-19 response sounded amazing and responsible, and we'd had a discussion about that before. But then you read in the papers about the outbreaks like at Otero and these different outbreaks, so that you know that there's a dramatic difference between the safety of prisoners in the public prisons and the private prisons. So how much oversight do we have? Because your data obviously wasn't about the private prisons. And so how can we make sure that it's not luck of the draw where you end up stuck?
Madam Chair and Senator Cedillo Lopez. So when I went over all of the information regarding COVID, it does apply to all of our institutions, private, public, everybody that we directly oversee. Now, without a doubt, there was an outbreak at the Otero County institution. I want to give a little bit of an understanding of what that physical layout looks like so everybody really understands it. So the institution down there in Otero County, it's one big institution, and on half of it, there are state inmates held, and on the other half of it, there are U.S. Marshals held. And then down the street, there's another facility that houses, I believe, ICE detainees. And so what we have figured out, and I won't get into the whole detail because it might be a little too much for this particular group, but I'll go over as much as I can without boring you guys to death. So when we identified the very first case, the positive case in our state, it was at that institution. And that same week, we had just finished completing a large-scale project to test all staff members and 25% of inmates everywhere. And in that process, it was actually about a week, maybe not even a week, it was maybe 2 or 3 days later, we had an officer who was working. He was on shift when we received back a positive test for him. This was a test that was conducted shortly after we finished the big testing. Now, this individual comes back positive, and we had to go pull him off shift and take him out of the facility, place him on quarantine, and move forward. That same day, we had an inmate presenting with symptoms. Now, this inmate hadn't been tested in that first 25% group. So we pulled him out, sent him to medical. We did a test right away, sent it in. But that same day, his temperature elevated, spiked very, very quickly, and then he was sent off to the hospital. And in the time that he was transferred to the hospital, we found out that he was positive. So we did some major surveillance testing, tested lots of people, and we ended up with 2 or 3 separate result returns that started with 19 and then another increase of 20 and then from there 116, and we just kept seeing this explosion, and we saw it happening in different housing units. So it's our understanding or our belief that the virus was first introduced into that facility by the staff member that was initially identified positive and on shift. Now, one thing that is really important to note about that particular institution does not exist anywhere else. They have pods of 72, they hold 72 in them. Now, there are some pods of that size in other institutions, but they're usually celled. So maybe they're double-celled or single-celled pods. In this particular facility, they're all dorm style. So the beds are set up like bunk beds, top tier, bottom tier, and there are no individual cells. So what we were finding was this radius of positive cases around one individual of anywhere between 20 and 30. And so then we got really, really aggressive with our testing. We worked with the Department of Health. We decided we're going to just test and test. We tested 100% of the institution, staff, inmates, everybody. And then we started to test every 4 days throughout the duration of the outbreak in that institution. Well, simultaneous to that, we had discovered that the people on the other side of the building were not conducting the same kind of testing, not on their staff, not on their inmates. And so we started really hard to push that. And with the assistance of Governor Lujan Grisham, we were able to get in contact with the U.S. Marshals and come up with very, very strict regulations and rules for the company. That particular company is the MTC, the Management and Training Corporation. And we implemented rules for them to follow that mirrored our rules. It definitely was not a simple feat. It took a lot of teeth pulling and a lot of meetings and a lot of argument. And we finally were able to get them to come around to follow our same processes. And then we asked that corporation to apply those same techniques to the people at their facility down the road. And then from there, we started to make sure that we were in communication with all of the federal entities. So the other outbreaks that I think you're referring to, the one at Cibola and other locations, those are all also federally run institutions. And what we have established in place now, and it's really only in effect with the marshals, the ICE folks have not been nearly as compliant as we are pushing them to be. But we are now able to enter into any of the institutions that hold marshals or even local jails and conduct inspections to make sure that they're following the same isolation, separation, sanitation requirements that we're following. And then the Department of Health also will go in and help them test their populations. Now, I believe that one of the reasons, and I'll just knock on some wood here at my table, I hope that one of the reasons that we've seen such a dramatic drop in positive cases is because we are now separating everybody at intake. And there's not a single person who gets sent from the intake facility to any other general population location without being tested and making sure that there's a negative test received. And that's not always the situation for people we receive, though. We receive people from out there in the community. We receive people from some jails that will come to us with positive results. But that separation and isolation at intake has been a big difference maker. And then I believe the other big difference maker is the fact that there just are not any other facilities that are structured the way that facility is structured. There's no cells, and isolation, separation, quarantine was very, very complicated at that facility. We did figure it out, we did manage it, but it was definitely much more complicated than when we've seen positive cases in other institutions. And also now, whenever there's any positive case anywhere, it's an immediate 100% rapid result testing. And that actually holds true for both jails and federal institutions in New Mexico.
Congratulations on that. And it's interesting because the federal government, for their agencies have to comply with state law unless it interferes with their primary essential government function. And so it seems like they should be more cooperative. And then I last time, and you and I talked about this, and I'd love for you to clarify this. In our subcommittee, there were some comments made about your department not wanting to have to be measured by performance goals, and there seemed to be some conflict there. And I raised at that time in the hearing that, for example, the state, your department, has done so well on PREA, and that's great, but it wasn't even something that was measured. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on how legislative finance evaluations, what are the goals you want to be measured by? And could you explain the difference in communication, or how that was explained differently last time?
Madam Chair and Senator Cedillo Lopez, yes, we had a great conversation that day. I called you and sent you that information on PREA. And for everybody else, members of the committee, there is quite a lot of information available on our website, not just on PREA, but on a lot of other items that we report on. And before we leave, I'll maybe put that in the chat if I can do that. Give you guys our web link and refer you to where we have reports available for your viewing. But yeah, PREA is something that we do really great on in this agency. In fact, we're one of about 4 states, I believe, that has been certified by the American Correctional Association for full compliance in all of our institutions in both ACA standards and PREA requirements. And last year we were provided with an award. It's called the Lucy Hayes Award that acknowledges those accomplishments. So thank you for bringing that up. Now, as far as performance measures, yeah, that's something that's a complicated conversation. The way it works when we're having those conversations is that we're having a debate back and forth with our group, some folks from the DFA group, and then of course some folks from the LFC group. And in this particular conversation, as it was talked about last time, there was some commentary about us wanting to eliminate things like measuring assaults. And that really was never our intention. What we actually wanted to do was stop throwing the kitchen sink at you, so to speak. So instead of just talking about everything that was considered an assault under those really loose guidelines, we really wanted it to be really specific to events or incidents that actually led to either hospitalization or involved a weapon or potentially a group element. That's what we really wanted to measure. At present, what the assault measurement captures includes things like attempted assaults and fights that are more closely aligned with horseplay types of behaviors. So I really wanted to make a distinction between an inmate who shows the stance that he's going to hit you and an inmate who actually goes through with hitting you. And I think that at present, that particular performance measure really doesn't capture the individuals that exercise self-control, and it really only focuses on people, or it really focuses on kind of everybody, and then I don't think you guys can see a true picture. And I believe that was the case for most of the performance measures that we asked for modification to. There's absolutely nothing about the agency that I'm not willing to discuss and share.
Thank you. And this is for Ms. Martinez. What does absconding mean? What exactly does that mean? Is it a scary word?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, so basically someone who fails to report, someone who changes their address without reporting that to the probation officer, someone who fails to just check in. And you know, right now in this COVID world, really we're doing virtual check-ins. So if I call you, I mean, it's a simple telephone call, it's a FaceTime call, it's a virtual check-in. So we're truly trying to work with our population to get them to check in. So basically when someone's declared an absconder, number one, they fail to report. Number two, a field call is completed at their residence or the last known residence. We reach out to our local hospitals, our local detention centers to make sure that they're not in custody or hospitalized. We also check with their emergency contact that they have listed to see how we can get in contact with them as well. So that we go through these steps. You know, obviously with the sex offender population, if they cut off their GPS, we issue the warrant immediately. Other populations like minimum supervision and medium supervision have 30 days to check in. Our high supervision level, They have to check in a minimum of 2 times per month, and 2 field calls have to be completed at their residence. Now, special programs is a little different. So community corrections and intensive supervision, they have to report. They can't have like a failure to report longer than 72 hours. And that's just part of our policy. So I hope that answered.
So if after the 72 hours passes, then they're just listed as an absconder, and then that process kicks in.
We still, by policy, we still have to complete the field call, contact family emergency that's listed, still have to do the detention center, the hospital check-in, and the field call. We also send letters. We send letters to the last known address as well.
Okay, thank you. And then we had a great presentation on algorithmic justice. And that we're talking about different assessment tools. And I wanted, do you look at, and so I wanted to talk a little bit or to hear a little bit about Compass as you use it. Because one of the things we've seen is that some other assessment tools might have a disparate impact on race. Do you keep track of, I mean, is it possible that Compass would say one group is more likely to not pose a problem in the community and need less supervision than another group? Do you look for that? And
Madam Chair, members of the committee, so as you are all aware, we're trying to implement our new system. It's called Omni, or the Offender Management Network. We're trying to implement that hopefully by the end of next year, but our system today is so outdated that it's difficult to only track that information. So with Compass, in our new system, we'll be able to track that.
so right now we don't.
Do you have not on the probation parole side.
Okay, because that seems pretty important for, at least when I was very impressed with the presentation we had. It seems very important to look at these tools and make sure that they're fairly applied and that they don't ask for criteria. Because one example they gave is one of the criteria is whether a family member had any criminal behavior. And I don't know, I've never looked at Compass. I don't know what it asks, what the algorithm looks like. But if they ask whether a family member had ever been involved with the criminal justice system, that might have a disproportionate impact. And so that might be something you want to look at more closely to see what's the relevance of that criteria. And maybe there are certain kinds of crimes that lend themselves. So, but anyway, I appreciate the presentation. It was very helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. And I do want to say, I think we're going to talk more about absconding a little bit later with some of the other folks who are presenting this afternoon. One thing that occurred to me is that we have a really packed agenda this afternoon. And if there's anyone who is not getting a question fully answered, what I'm just going to suggest is that we submit some written questions to corrections that perhaps you could respond to us as a committee through Elizabeth Johnson if we don't move along. I still have quite a few members who wish to ask questions. And so, I was just going to say about my client, who was a poster child for probation reform, was characterized as absconding, and he just missed an appointment because his phone was broken and then his car wasn't working. So that can also mean absconding. So I think we have to get better at whether somebody's actually trying to evade supervision as opposed to coping with being a poor person, trying to raise children coming out of prison. Next, I have Representative Baldonado. He may have stepped away, so let me go to Representative Tara Lujan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary and Melanie, for your presentation today. I have a couple of questions. I hope I'm going to make them quicker. But I wanted to ask you, Secretary Lucedo, Chair, when you discussed the quarantine of our inmates during COVID, when they're medically quarantined, I just have a quick question. Do you, during the process, do you have allow them access to their attorneys via Zoom or by phone, or what is their access to communication to outside resources?
We definitely do. All of the people incarcerated in all of our institutions, public and private, have access to attorneys. The way that process works is that they schedule a phone call through the caseworker between the inmate and the attorney, and then bring the inmate into an office, an area where they have privacy, and then the caseworker will dial and leave the room so that that conversation can take place in private. And we are working right now on making that available by video. It is available at some of our institutions, but not quite everywhere. And it really was just a matter of designating a location where we had the ability to set up a network connection to a computer to create that video link. But we do have that available. And in fact, even on our website in the COVID information section, there's a separate area for attorneys to visit so that they will know about anything that they need to know about clients that they may have incarcerated.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary. And just on that note, when you said, and I appreciate this, that you said that it's a no-cost phone access now during COVID. But can you explain to me the costs that incarcerated folks incur? I mean, what are they being charged to even make phone calls or have paperwork processed or even printed out for them?
Madam Chair, and I can't see who's speaking, so
Madam Chair, Secretary, this is Tara Lujan. I'm sorry. I have a little one that's using our computer for schoolwork and things, so I'm trying to conserve and use I'm not on visual. I'm just using audio.
Apologies.
It's Representative Tara Lujan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right, Madam Chair and Representative Lujan, I just wanted to make sure to address you properly. So we use a vendor. We actually use a vendor for our telephone services. And so inmates purchase money on their phone accounts or on their phone cards. And that's how they pay for a number of minutes, sort of similar to the way that like a cell phone plan used to work when it was by minutes. And that's the process. We have to use a vendor for telephone calls because in institutions, all phone calls are recorded and then can be scanned for security types of information. And in this situation, we worked with our vendor to make a specific number of phone calls, 20-minute phone calls available for every incarcerated person available. At this time, the vendor is covering one phone call per week, and then we're covering an additional phone call per week. So they're receiving right now 8 no-charge phone calls per week.
Madam Chair and Secretary, thank you for that information. I really do appreciate it. I wanted some clarity on that. And I just wanted to address that in accordance to your reintegration program and say and ask that because I know that we have better outcomes when our inmates maintain outside relationships. And so I was just wondering if you do or have you looked at increasing those minutes, those free minutes or that free time for outside calls for or before or during the reintegration process that you were talking about?
Madam Chair and Representative Lujan, not specifically yet, but I think that's a great idea and something that we definitely can explore. We do some programming inside of our institutions that we focus on family reunification, and we also work closely with CYFD when there is a family member, a child who has oversight by CYFD or is in the care of a foster home or other type of living arrangement. So we do recognize absolutely that those connections really make a huge difference to a person's success when they release. And I think that's a great idea that we can explore as we move forward and really flesh out what the detailed duties and areas that new reentry division will cover. So at this time, it's not something that we've looked at, but I'm certain that it is something that we will explore moving forward.
Madam Chair, Secretary, thank you for those questions. I just have one other question for Melanie. During her presentation, she stated that we had, is it 20 behavioral health services providers? I was just wondering, how many inpatient programs are there, and in which districts for the inpatient drug rehabs and things like that? Because I know, there are waiting lists. I know that we don't have a lot of providers out there that are taking, well, there's a backup list. And so I just want to know what's available for inpatient programs for our parolees.
Madam Chair and Representative, so we are limited with inpatient treatment providers, and there's very minimal. But like I mentioned, right now, inpatient isn't being recommended by whether it's an assessment, and I think I mentioned that, you know, sometimes on their judgment and sentences, the judge is requiring them to complete inpatient. So we just request an additional hearing to explain that during the assessment, inpatient treatment was not recommended. We find that more individuals are successful with intensive outpatient treatment at this time.
Madam Chair, Melanie, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, because we know that, you know, that they are being headed back into jails or back into prison when they break their parole. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask about that. And that's all I have right now. I have other questions, but I'll limit to them now. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentations, Melanie and Secretary Lucero. It's really well done. Thank you.
Okay, next I have Senator Linda Lopez.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the presentations that have been given. And I just have, I think, just one point of clarification with regards to asking for the parole board. And Ms. Martinez, could you just briefly explain what is the process that happens when someone who has been taken back into custody and has to go in front of the parole board, whether to decide if they're released or if they're put back into the system? What is the process that the parole board goes through?
Of course. So when an individual, Madam Chair and members of the committee, so when an individual violates their conditions of parole, they have what's called an administrative hearing. So the hearing officer determines if there's enough evidence that they violated the conditions of parole. If he or she determines that they violated their conditions of parole, then the individual is sent in front of the parole board. And usually the parole board will ask, did you admit or deny that you violated your conditions, and how? And sometimes the parolee will give testimony. If they are found, the hearing officer finds that they are not in violation of their conditions, then the recommendation is made to the parole board to release them, reinstate them, or continue them on parole.
Okay. And is there, that comes from the department then, is there a packet of information that's prepared? In other words, I'm just looking just for purposes of explanation, what else has to come in front of the parole board for them for their hearing?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, and I apologize, can you repeat the question? You cut out just for a second. You're on mute.
Senator, you're muted.
How's that, better? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
What I was just asking is there a packet of information that then comes from the department that then is then given to the parole board for their review?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, yes, it's called a parole application hearing packet, and it's compiled of all of a parole violation report, supporting evidence, supporting audio, supporting documentation, and the inmate or the parole violator is given a copy of that, as well as the parole board.
Okay, and then with I'll say the parolee, when they're in front of the parole board, are they allowed to have legal counsel?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, they have to fit or meet the criteria in order to have representation. So usually if they don't have some sort of learning disability or mental health, and they don't fall within a certain criteria, they're not able to have legal representation.
Okay. And then I guess, another question, and thank you for that information. And Madam Chair, just one question with regards to our private prisons and the COVID issue. As you know, some of us, and I'm sure maybe the Secretary and her staff have already seen an article in one of the blog newsletters that was recently posted about, I think, one of our facilities there in Milan, talking about the response, because they had, I think, over 175 of the inmates that were COVID positive. And I guess just for clarification, what do we do as a state? Because that's a public health issue. They may, do the federal issues for whatever the contracts are. That's still a public health issue for us. So what is the conversation that you are having, Madam Secretary, with the feds and the leadership, especially, at that facility there in Milan? I'm curious. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair and Senator Lopez, so I briefly talked a little bit about this with Senator Cedillo Lopez, so I apologize if I'm a little bit redundant, but I want to make sure that the committee understands that it has definitely been a long road to get to the place where we're at in working with our federal partners. But it is incredibly important to Governor Lujan Grisham to make sure that all New Mexicans are safe, that testing supplies are available to all New Mexicans, and that regardless of whether a person is housed in a jail, a county jail, or a state institution, private, public, federal, whatever the situation is, that the same resources are made available to them. So what we've done to deal with some of those issues in those federal institutions, and that one is another one of those federal institutions that had something of an outbreak, and then we had to intervene. In that situation, we reached out to the private vendor, which is CoreCivic out there in Cibola at the Four Cs Federal Institution, and we talked with them about continued capacity or ability to do business in our state. And we're very firm with them about their requirements, what our expectations were for them, and how it may affect their business licensure and ability to operate within the borders of our state if they did not meet the same guidelines that the state of New Mexico Corrections Department had set up and that we were having people adhere to. So we sent them all of our regulations, all of our recommendations, and then the Department of Health actually sent doctors and nurses and other service providers to the institution to actually conduct the rapid response with them. So rather than just relying on them and whoever their medical contract vendor is, the Department of Health went in, oversaw, looked at their situation, and they did an evaluation to determine whether there was cross-contamination happening from area to area. And then they also straight up conducted tests on all of their inmates and their staff members. This is something that we continue to argue about and things like that. But we finally have the United States Marshals in a position where, through many conversations and a lot of back and forth, they are regularly reporting to my command center, which is operational 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they're sharing with us their information about what they're doing to isolate and contain. And if at any point we don't believe that it's in alignment with what our requirements are, then we will send an inspector from our agency along with a person from the Department of Health to go in and check and verify and start the process again from scratch. But they being the U.S. Marshals and the vendor who operate that institution, we've been incredibly firm with them to make sure that they follow all of our regulations and rules. And the same goes for determining when an individual has become negative. So rather than just following the time and symptom-based strategy, they are also conducting the double testing to determine that a person is recovered. And before, that was not the situation in that institution. So we feel confident now that their sanitation procedures and practices are appropriate. And we've also required for them to make notifications and send testing results to communities where people are releasing from their institutions too. That was also a big factor. So thank you for that question, Senator.
And thank you very much for the follow-up, because again, the employees live in the community, and we don't want that, for the spread to continue. So I just appreciate the backup information. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Maestas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary. And I just wanted to thank Director Martinez. I had a constituent issue a couple of weeks back, and she was incredibly responsive. And it was regarding voting. So, real quick, Madam Chair, Madam Secretary, is there if clerks won't accept somebody's voter registration, what's the process? Is there a handy dandy email folks can get their final out paperwork? Go see what steps should we take to increase voter participation of former probationers?
Before I turn the machine over around, Madam Chair and Representative Maestas, I do want to just let everybody know that we have been directly meeting with the Secretary of State directly and with members of her team to make sure that our staff are sharing data with her staff to make sure that the information that they receive from us is immediate and there's no delay. And now I'm going to put on my mask, and then I'm going to move this laptop so that you can see Director Martinez.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, so we've had issues, not just this past year, but over the last couple of years with individuals who aren't restored their voting rights. So when an individual is discharged, they get what's called a certificate of completion. We also send that to the Secretary of State, but the Secretary of State's office does receive all of that discharge information, like Secretary Tafoya Lucero mentioned, daily. So they get that information daily. And I would have to look at your example specifically as far as like why they weren't given their voting rights back. It could be something as simple as an order of discharge wasn't submitted to the courts and they're still showing active. I mean, I would have to definitely take a look at that.
No, thank you very much. No, you took care of it. And then hopefully next year or the next voting cycle, you won't have to deal with any of that stuff. That provision should have been taken out long ago. Where you just, are you 18? Are you a citizen? Are you off probation? And then you and the Secretary of State don't have to worry about it. The probation bill, as you know, we passed a probation bill in 2015 that was near unanimous, dealing with what we refer to as unsupervised probation. And then, of course, in 2019, we passed a massive probation that included like 8 or 10 various reforms. There was a glitch in one of the paragraphs that we fixed the following year, but we ran out of time. So what's frustrating about that legislation is that 90% can be done administratively, can be done by the department. So let me just ask you, the Secretary mentioned that discharge inmates that are doing well. And I think we've had this conversation in the past, but why do you discharge them? Why don't you merely tell them not to report? Why don't you just put them on unsupervised probation?
Madam Chair, Representative Maestas, so I think we had a brief discussion last year. Probation parole, we really want to see them get to a point of stability. And usually, some are completing a 5-year sentence, and halfway through, they complete all of their requirements. They show stability, full-time employment. Right now, and I think we discussed this briefly last year, is our system doesn't auto-generate Representative, if you're on supervision and you're on unsupervised probation and you have a run-in with the law, you're in custody, our system doesn't auto-generate arrest and hold. So we wouldn't know you're in custody. There's no reason for us to follow you as an unsupervised member. You know, probation parole really wants to get you to a point in life where there's stability and you can move on with your life. I feel like, and again, unsupervised probation is like dangling, you know, they always have that tail. And we want to get them to a point where they don't have to worry about probation parole. I think you mentioned last year that someone who was on unsupervised probation and they were, I don't know, pulled over for a traffic citation, then that was a violation of their probation. So we kind of want to avoid those technical violations if we can.
No, thank you, Madam Chair, Director Martinez. I would ask that you fix your software system so that if in fact someone is on unsupervised and they get arrested, there would be a hold. That's a software issue. That's not really a legal issue or a statutory issue. It's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Because you're right, we want folks to move on, but we also want, you know, that little nudge that folks don't do things that force them to get arrested for a crime. And there's also that incentive. If we put it in statute and incentivize unsupervised probation, it's not arbitrary. It's clear, it's precise, and it lowers caseloads so that you can focus on those 20 or 40 folks who have a higher probability of recidivism than 110. But anyway, we can. I think we want to get to the same place. I think philosophically we agree. With regards to, you mentioned a word, technical violation. Have you defined that within DOC? Do you now differentiate between a technical, what we put in statute as a technical violation as opposed to a standard violation?
Madam Chair, Representative Maestas, if I'm understanding the question, how do we identify a technical violation? So a technical violation is basically anything that is not a new crime. That's my understanding of it. But as far as standard conditions, those are standard conditions that every individual has to comply with on probation, parole, whether they're intensive supervision, on sex offender supervision, and then any special conditions that are imposed by the judge or the parole board are special conditions that they would have to comply with.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Martinez. No, I wasn't talking about standard conditions, but in statute this last year, we differentiated between a technical violation and a standard violation. In the first year, we called it a non-technical violation, and that just sounded too bureaucratic. So there's a violation, and then there's a technical violation. Does your department differentiate between the two, between breaking the rules and breaking the law?
Madam Chair and Representative Maestas, so yes, we do have a difference in technical violations versus, you know, breaking the law versus breaking conditions.
Oh, fantastic. Do you, and we also wanted, I think in statute for the department to keep stats on that. And then one of the final drafts eliminated the stat requirement. I think the stat requirement probably will go back into the bill. And so my point is that in previous bills, there was a implementation date further out than normal. Most crime bills kick in July 1st. The solitary confinement bill kicked in, 2 years after July 1st. And then the probation bill last year, certain components of it were delayed until January 1 or the following July 1st. I don't anticipate that happening. I anticipate this year's probation bill going into effect July 1st. So nothing stops you from moving in that direction, given some of the provisions that have overwhelming legislative support. So anyway, I just wanted to nudge you in that direction so that you're ready in terms of the software, the ability to keep good stats and differentiate between technical and non-technical or standard violations. Thank you, Madam Chair. And if the Secretary wanted to respond or the Director, that'd be fine.
I would just like to ask that the responses be kept brief too, because we still have a few more people and we're running right up to the next presentation now.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Maestas. So we need to continue to explore options. There are a few things that we're looking at right now as far as introduction of legislation regarding probation. And I think it would be great if we could talk perhaps with you just directly, get both of each other's feedback, ideas, and figure out a way to move forward that will benefit the safety of our community and also do what we can to help the people that we supervise. So I'm gonna leave it at that, but I'll say that I would like to arrange to meet with you, Representative, if that works.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Ryu, did you have questions? Representative Baldonado, are you back? Okay, I'm going to ask some questions, and I might ask one or two that you would prefer to respond to in greater depth, and you can do that, you know.
Hi, Gail. Sorry to interrupt. This is Jacob. I can't raise my hand. I've been trying to. Could I ask one quick one before we go to you? I'm
Okay,
sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This is purely for my own education. When a client is written up on any probation violation, I guess I want to understand, how is the data currently collected? So the officer, issues the notice, right, of the violation. It's then sent to the district attorney and most likely to the court, right, who continues to have jurisdiction over that person. I want to just understand from the department side, is that information then uploaded somewhere, right? And then is there data that we can extract from those data sources? You see what I'm saying? Is there are those all in one place? Is there analysis we can do on those to identify trends, to identify reasons? I think that's really what the issue is for a lot of folks. For me, is from a process standpoint, what do you all do with that information, just that data itself?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, so we enter case notes in our system, and we also have what's our offender folders in each region and in each district office. And if I'm hearing the question correctly, we do keep those stats.
Okay. And that's done ostensibly because some data is entered into your system from each instance. So every time there's a probation violation, some information about that is entered into a system and aggregated. Is that what happens?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, so our system doesn't support, our new system will, but the current system does not support it.
Okay. So the new system, what sort of data capacity will that support? Meaning, could I ask as a legislator, I want to understand how many people who are on, probation because, they blew a 0.01 or whatever, or got wrote up, for some breathalyzer issue, right? What is, I guess, the level of specificity, the level of detail of the type of data that we'll be able to extract from this new system as policymakers?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, so the new system will be able to identify individuals who violated their conditions, the type of violation, the demographics, the area, the location, what the violation was, and it'll break down types of violations.
And I guess the question then is, and that's right, I appreciate that, and I think that's exactly the one. What is the level of specificity in the data that we can extract with regard to types of violation? I think that's the question. I think, you know, is it just going to be a broad technical, non-technical? They have picked up a new charge or no? Or is there going to be more fields that allow us to do more deeper granular analysis?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, so the new system will be able to identify conditions. It'll break it down by location, and then it'll break it down by probation, parole, and dual supervision.
And when you say conditions, I'll leave it at that. I think it'll probably be worth revisiting the issue once the system's in effect, and we can all look at it at the data capacity. But I think that's my concern. Pardon me. Is strikes me that the more specific and the more granular that sort of data parsing can be when it comes to the type of violation, especially a technical violation, which we've understood today is defined as anything that's not picking up a new charge. Because my concern, again, is even though we would have a new system, if we're not able to go any deeper than that, I don't think it really moves the policy conversation forward very much. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize for jumping in there. But again, I don't even see my little hand. My computer's telling me a really harsh message to never talk again because it's not even giving me the chance to raise my hand. So
we'll try to get you fixed up for next time.
It's fine. I'm just making a joke. Have a good afternoon. Thank you all.
Senator, I wanted to invite you to perhaps work on your question and what you would like addressed. If I am going to suggest, I think maybe a couple of my questions, I'm going to have to do that with. I don't think we're going to have time for a thorough discussion of some of my questions. So if you send this to Elizabeth, and anyone else too, we can perhaps compile some questions from our committee members.
And Madam Chair, if I may, just real quick, I was trying to find the little hand button as well. I can't find it on my computer, but I have just two questions that I don't think will take very long. If I just could, or.
All right. Try to make it quick, and I'll ask the secretary and the director to answer quickly or tell you that they'll have to answer in a report to the committee.
Okay, so I have a constituent who was on probation, went off probation about, 3 or 4 years ago, and went down to try to register to vote for this election. I was told that she could not register to vote because she did not have a certificate of completion. So she went back to corrections department to get a certificate of completion since she'd been off probation for about 3 or 4 years. And the corrections department told her, you owe $80 that you did not pay us 3 or 4 years ago. We won't give you a certificate of completion until you pay us the $80. And so this concerns me because at least statutorily, a certificate of completion by the corrections department is referenced in 31-13-1. And it has to do explicitly with the ability of somebody to have their voting rights restored. And it says that someone who has served, not completed, served the entirety of a sentence imposed for felony conviction, including a term, not the provisions, a term of probation or parole, shall be issued a certificate of completion by the corrections department. Now, we could have a very different conversation if this said satisfied the conditions of probation, but it doesn't. It says the term of probation, and it seems to me like you all are putting a poll tax into place, stopping somebody from voting, and it concerns me greatly. Please respond.
Madam Chair and Senator, so it concerns me as well. I'm not sure, which office this is out of, but if you want to email me and I can take care of it, specific to the case, but a certificate of completion, you're exactly right. Once someone is completed, whether it's satisfactory or unsatisfactory, they're completed with the term, period.
Right.
So what you brought up today really concerns me, and I'd appreciate it if you could just shoot me a quick email, and I can look into it for you.
I'll be happy to do that. I do have the former offender's name, and which should be sufficient for you to be able to look into her file and see what's going on.
Perfect.
So we can resolve this. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome, Senator. So I have a couple of really quick questions, and if you have to look them up and answer through email to Elizabeth Johnson, that will be fine. Ms. Martinez, in your report, somebody's making a lot of noise, but it looks like everybody's muted. In your report, you said there's 60 successful program completions monthly. What's the rate of that? Out of how many? 60 out of 60 or 60 out of 400, or what are we talking about?
So I think on my presentation, I mentioned that we referred about, I want to say over 1,300 to specific programs. So as you know, that number changes, right? So someone completes a 30-day, they may have to be referred again. So this is just upon initial intake, start of their probation to the end of their program.
Okay. On a second quick question, you were, this was, you weren't asked about this yet. On your slide number 8, Ms. Martinez, you said you had a huge list of potential sanctions before revocation. A lot of alternatives to that. Is that an exhaustive list? Is someone supposed to do all of those things before going to court, or how does that work?
Madam Chair and members of the committee, so you know that it's not an exhaustive list. It depends on the individual, and it depends on the type of violation that they've completed. So it all depends on, do they pose a danger to the community? You know, what is that danger risk? When someone violates, they also complete what's called an alternative compass assessment. So depending on the level of their violation. But again, I use the DWI 6th or greater example, because if someone walks in the door positive for alcohol, we would handle that differently than we would, you know, someone who comes in and didn't complete their treatment. So it really depends on the individual, their crime, and the danger they pose to the community.
Yeah, I just think we need to work on this some, because when a judge pulls up a defendant's name or a respondent, in this case, CYFD case, and say, oh, he's an absconder, and there's been absolutely no intent whatsoever to not make himself subject to his probation. So I don't think that meets the definition.
And Madam Chair, I think you're aware of this already, but it also depends in the judicial district, correct? I mean, we can do jail diversion, we can, you know, alternatives to jails, and it really depends on the district attorney and the judge if that's allowed. We still have to report those violations through what's called a preliminary violation report. So it's basically like a warning stating this is what happened and this is what we want them to continue on supervision with this level of supervision or whatever the result is. And it really is up to the district attorney and the judge to agree to that.
Okay, I just think if it does depend on the judicial district and the district attorney there, I worry about equal justice or equal access to justice throughout the state as well. On the parole board, Senator Lopez asked you about right to counsel. Is that statutory or is that by rule?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, it is statutory.
It's statutory. Okay. Senator Lopez, I think you should be looking at that. Okay. Now, I have a few other questions, but they're a little bit more in depth. One is regarding the cutting of the Dismas House budget, which I know the Secretary is going to get back to us about that. But it just seems to me that it's incongruent to cut a budget for halfway houses, because what you end up with is people serving in-house parole. And that ends up costing a lot more money than a halfway house. So that's just a statement for consideration. And then I'm wondering about the LFC had a report this summer about corrections, and they were It was in July, and it was about inmate classification. And there are mandatory overrides that push low custody prisoners to medium custody facilities. Does that not cost us more money?
Madam Chair, thank you. Before I answer that, I just want to make a comment very quickly because it actually was brought up in the subcommittee meeting last week. But there's a few of the performance measures where we've discovered, myself and the team, that the agency itself was just reporting information incorrectly. And I'll just give you one very quick example, and then I'll move on to the question about classification or overclassification. So for the reporting of in-house parolees, we have been inaccurately reporting this information. And I'll tell you how that happened. There would be, let's say for a quarter, there's one individual who is incarcerated for 3 months in the same quarter, and that person has 2 active charges. We would be collecting the information from the institution, we the agency, every month, and each charge would be counted as 2 individuals. I don't quite know how that happened, but we did fix it now. And then at the end of the first month, they'd get 2. The end of the second month, 2. At the end of the third month, 2. And then they would just do a sum rather than identifying that individual as that individual. So one person might be counted 3 times in a quarter, and then it shows this crazy percentage number of our population that are on in-house parole. Today I did check that number, and we do have 90 people that are in-house parole, which represents 1.47% of our population. And now with respect to the classification system, so that is a big issue, huge undertaking in the process right now. We have been working with the University of New Mexico's Institute for Social Research for a number of reasons, but mostly because we know that the system that we have in place is antiquated and old. I want to make a distinction, though, between the types of overrides and what's valid. There are overrides in the system that are labeled as mandatory overrides and others that are labeled as discretionary overrides. And we do think that what has happened is that through the years, different people, different administrations, in response to different incidents that have occurred out in the world, have made changes to some of these override provisions. And actually right now, I have gotten together a team of people from throughout the state, and we're meeting weekly. There are a bunch of classification experts. I'm part of that conversation, and a few of my other staff members. And we're figuring out what changes we can make in the classification policy now, and also in the inmate discipline policy now, that would affect the way an inmate is classified, but without making any modifications to the actual classification scoring instrument. And we really did take a long, hard look, have been, since we've been working with Ms. Caldwell at the Legislative Finance Committee, because it really did show us that some of those overrides, while they're mandatory and we do have to apply them as it stands, we think that there could be some room for modification. And I'll give you one example. A person might be prevented from going to a level 1 facility if their sentence is longer than 2.5 years. That is not something that's part of the score. It is already accounted for in the score. And our best guess is that at once upon a time, people thought that number led to escape. And we just don't see any evidence to indicate that. So we're combing through the data and we're figuring out what the history of all that information was. But more importantly, we're figuring out what's best practices for those types of incidents. And then we're making modifications within the policy to change some of those mandatory overrides. So for this particular example, the mandatory override might change from 2.5 years to 3 years or 3.5 years, depending on what we find in the data and what our group of experts come up with. So it certainly is more expensive to hold somebody at a higher custody level, and we definitely have beds available in our lower custody facilities, and we're really trying to get our heads wrapped around that to make changes to benefit the system and the state budget, and maintain public safety in our state and our facilities.
I appreciate that, because that is something that is policy and that you can definitely change. I would just suggest maybe including some folks who have a really long history here in New Mexico, who maybe worked on the Duran consent decree, maybe someone from the Sentencing Commission, to participate with you in figuring out whether you're going to have mandatory overrides. And for example, I understand that if there's a detainer and it's for any detainer, it's an automatic mandatory, but sometimes detainers are for failure to appear in court to pay a traffic fine. And so do we really want to keep that person in versus somebody who committed a robbery? You know, that's a totally different situation. So that's kind of for another time. I actually had quite a few questions about the budget, and I really don't want to go any longer. So I'm going to send them to you through through an email that will, you know, we can all kind of work on an email with Elizabeth, our staff attorney. But I would like to, I know your budget's reflecting a decrease for the coming year. And I guess I think I'd like to know too, if ultimately you could be looking at closing any of the institutions. Just having one open is a huge expense. And we're starting to get a decline in population. And I'd like to know really too how your budget for next year is supporting reduction of recidivism. So, you know, we may not get to talk about that now, but I would be interested in hearing from the department on that. And I really thank you and Director Martinez for all the time you spent. If you could stay with us to hear the other folks talk about probation parole, that would be wonderful. Be glad to have you stay. So thank you again.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, and now we're running a little bit late. We do have the Sentencing Commission up next. We have comments from the Sentencing Commission, Linda Freeman, the Executive Director, and Douglas Carver, the Deputy Director and former staff attorney for this committee. So go right ahead and thank you very much.
Let's see.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think I'm on. Linda, are you on? I see your picture.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Aaron, for field marshaling all of us.
So Douglas, I am on. Why don't you go ahead and start, and I'll start my video and you can start yours.
Okay. So you want me to start with with a few comments first, or do you want to start, Linda?
I believe I can give an overview and we can go into you. I apologize, members of the committee. You'll have to excuse us as we're somewhat clunky trying to figure out this format. So I'm glad to speak with you guys today. I will keep my comments very brief. And I believe some of the questions that you had during the Secretary and Directors of Corrections presentation. One of the things that the Sentencing Commission is doing is we've partnered with Dr. Noah Painter-Davis, who is one of the criminologists here in the Department of, in UNM's Criminology Department. And we are working with him. He's actually part of a bigger grant, part of the National HEAL initiative that was funded by NIH. And what we've done is we're actually working with Director Martinez to work on creating a more refined recidivism report this year that will look at things like violations, like what types of violations people had if they were returned, breaking out recidivism by those who were discharged versus those who were paroled. So it's an exciting initiative. I think we're probably still a couple of months away before we'll have something to actually share with you guys. But I did want to let you know that a lot of the questions that you guys had, I think will be addressed by some of, at least in part, by this report. And I think that that's exciting. But at the same time, I did want to say, in the existing system, it's not so much that the information's not there. We're working with some of the violations data. In some cases, there's too much information. What we are actually seeing is that it's free-form text, so it's hard to make quick use of that information. So I think in the case of, being able to know what those violations are and being able to categorize them quicker, that will definitely be responsive to some of the policy questions that I believe that Senator Candelaria was alluding to. In terms of probation parole, I don't have anything else that's directly responsive. I do want to just let the committee know that we have recently we have a new chair. Our new chair is Justice Ed Chavez, and as you all know, he was very involved in the initiative to pass House Bill 267 a couple of sessions ago. So it's an exciting time for the commission. We are still going through the process of briefing the justice and getting him up to speed. But I think that will have a tremendous impact on our commission and the things that you'll see going forward from the commission. With that, I will go ahead and defer to Douglas. And if you have any questions, I'll stand for questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Linda. And again, I'll be pretty brief in the interest of time. The main news I wanted to give the committee was that our reform committee, as you know, has been meeting, and one of the issues that the committee has decided to tackle, we decided at our last meeting in our proceeding, that's related to today's discussion, is that they're going to work on a geriatric parole bill. As you all know, the geriatric parole reform provision has been knocked around for a number of years. I remember drafting a bill back when I was staff attorney for the original CJRS in 2013, 2014. And that provision has always been wrapped up in other broader reforms that don't make it through the system, don't make it through the legislative process, and therefore it dies. There's a lot of consensus around the need for this provision. And so what the committee is doing is looking at the geriatric parole provisions as they were modified in House Bill 263 in the last session. There were a couple of small changes through that process, not a lot, and they're going to use that as the basis of a bill to bring forward to the legislature this year. So just to hit the highlights, and again, I'll be really quick, Madam Chair, because I know you all are on a tight schedule. The main provisions as they attach to geriatric parole are adding definitions for geriatric inmate, a permanently incapacitated inmate, and terminally ill inmate. So getting those definitions put into statute. But the big policy shift is really shifting the onus from the inmate to the department on initiating the process of obtaining geriatric parole. And so it rewrites and flips, again, the onus and some of the responsibilities, the existing provisions, so that the department needs to notify inmates who might be eligible, for instance. And a provision to note, of course, is if an inmate hasn't served their minimum sentence, they may still be considered eligible for the program. They list the criteria under which you would be eligible for geriatric parole, and notes that in general, the board shall release an inmate from medical or geriatric parole unless it finds by clear and convincing evidence that the release is incompatible with the welfare of society, and states in writing its reason for the finding. And so both of those are fairly important. The board can't just deny, they have to say why they're denying. They have to use the clear and convincing evidence standard. And the language also notes the board shall not deny medical or geriatric parole solely because of an inmate's criminal history. Again, this is that's just to hit the highlights of the provisions from HB 263 in the last session. The committee just decided at its meeting 2 weeks ago to tackle this issue. We'll be actually looking at the various versions of the bill that were presented in the last session and come up with a bill draft starting with our meeting on Thursday. And Madam Chair, members of the committee, that's all I had for you today. And with Linda, I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
I'm looking to see if there are any hands raised on the official list, but people were having trouble with it earlier. So is there anyone who wishes to ask a question of the Sentencing Commission folks at this time? You can just let me know to take yourself off mute and speak up. Well, I just want to say I'm really happy to hear about retired Justice Chavez as the new chair of the Sentencing Commission. That I'm looking forward to you making a recommendation to us about probation and parole as well. The Sentencing Commission board, the members, the gubernatorial appointees. So hoping that you'll be looking at the ideas from the various groups who are presenting today. So I think with that, we're ready to go on to our next group. We have the Public Defender Department, the Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, and the ACLU. So I'm going to invite them to get started. Are they all on as panelists now, Aaron? Yes, looks like they are. Okay. Bennett, are you first?
I guess I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Madam Chairs, members of the committee, my name is Bennett Bauer. I'm the Chief Public Defender. We have a number of people and we have a short period of time. So we'll kind of pass the baton pretty quickly. We've worked this out so that we can just hit some major points here. I will be talking about achieving the overarching purposes of probation and parole. And then Jonathan Ibarra, who's a lawyer with the Public Defender's Office in Albuquerque and in the trenches on probation violations, will address the committee. Kim Chavez Cook will talk about technical violations and legislative fixes. Paul Heidel from NMCDLA will talk about parole and reentry during COVID. Baron Jones from the ACLU will talk about the practical challenges of reentry. And then Ricky Lee Chavez from the Criminal Defense Lawyers Association will talk about funding reform by savings from reduced incarceration. So we're going to have some specific information for the committee and also some specific proposals. But I think giving this some larger context, we don't want to lose sight of the larger issues with the criminal justice system, and probation and parole is really just one part of that system. And the problems that we can try to address with probation and parole really, and how it operates really goes far beyond anything the current administration is doing. I mean, the problems that they have inherited have a lot to do with the entire criminal justice system that existed before this secretary and her group took over. And really, as a society, we've underfunded many of the social supports that could keep people out of the criminal justice system and that could support people who've been convicted of crimes and are on probation or parole, and that could help those people reform and succeed. And frankly, I think that while we may not be able to address many of these issues in this current session, I think it's best for us all to keep in mind what some of those are. Last session, Representative Maestas, in the interim, introduced a bill to at least the Reform Subcommittee that proposed taking the Probation and Parole Department out from under the Department of Corrections and creating a separate entity under the governor's office. And I've had discussions with people about perhaps taking probation and parole and making it a part of actually a part of the judiciary. Because if you think about people that are on probation, specifically the Department of Probation, rather than putting it under Department of Corrections, which is most of its resources really go into incarcerating those people who've been sentenced, it should be, probation is really the court's probation. It's really a judge saying that I am giving you the opportunity to succeed in society with certain supports. And if you have that overseen by the judiciary, rather than by the people that run the prisons, I think you bring a different mindset. And while that seems like a big bite, and it is, talking about these kinds of structural changes now is important. And these things aren't unheard of. Reminding those of you that have been around for a while, as I have, that the Public Defender's Office used to be an executive agency under the governor. And I was the acting chief when there was a constitutional amendment passed and then enabling legislation in 2013 that took us out from under the governor, then Governor Martinez, and created an independent commission. And I can tell you that the Public Defender's Office is much better off now after that structural change, and a lot of work to bring us where we are. Ultimately, those kinds of structural changes are necessary for the legislature to consider for probation and parole, not because of the way necessarily it's being run by this administration, but simply because we have to always reanalyze and reimagine how we're doing things. But with that, I want to kind of pass the torch here to Jonathan Ibarra, who, as I said, is a lawyer in our Albuquerque office, to talk more about what he really sees on the ground in the courts in Albuquerque.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for having us. I just want to, as Chief Bauer mentioned, just talk briefly about kind of what we see generally in regards to these hearings. One of the handouts, I guess, that came to you all was my chart that I did last year when we testified about this, from a couple of days of probation violation hearings here in Bernalillo County, talking about, sort of what the general things were that the probation violations were for, and kind of broken into three categories: new arrest, failures to report, and other technical violations. And so back in October, pre-COVID, it was, pretty much about half of them were reporting violations. About a third were arrests, and then the other ones were technical violations. And so, that's all there. I went back and looked at the week of probation violations 2 weeks ago, just to kind of get some comparison about what's going on now. The technical violations have almost completely stopped being filed here in Bernalillo County. Not entirely, but mostly. I've also talked with the probation supervisor here, and that's what she said as well, that by and large, there aren't a great number of technical violations, mostly because, as the director previously testified to you all, they're not doing a lot of in-person check-ins, and so they're not catching some of those technical violations, I think, probably, or having to worry about it. What's of note is that the case numbers have gone down because of less technical violations, which means that there hasn't been at the same time, having the number of failures to report or the numbers of arrests having gone up in relation to there being less technical violations. And I think that's really important, so that this committee knows that the fact that we're not arresting people on technical violations is not causing a big jump in the other types of violations that are being seen. Most of the new arrests are drug-related arrests or other non-violent things, misdemeanors. Of all of those cases where there were arrests, I only saw 3 cases that were sort of violent. One of them was a person having mental issues who had a battery on a healthcare worker charge. One of them was an ag stalking, and that guy went to prison, and then a battery on a peace officer. And so none of them were significantly violent, and most of them were drug related. So that's kind of how well, that's exactly how it's been looking here. Again, I think that's consistent with what we've been seeing here in Bernalillo County. The other thing that I was asked to talk to you about is just a quick reminder, and I'll say it very briefly, about sort of how the process works when a person is arrested on a violation, at least here in Bernalillo County. The way the rules are laid out, just to remind the committee, once a person is arrested, the probation officer has 5 business days to write a report. Then the district attorney's office has 5 days to file a violation, a motion for a violation. And then it's 30 days before the person who's been arrested has a right to a hearing. So it's, and that's 30 calendar days, but that means it's about 45 days from the time a person is arrested until the time it's required that they have a hearing in the district court. And so that's a long time for a person to be sitting in custody without any hearing. They're pretty much always held without bond on a probation violation. And so so I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that. Right now, here in Bernalillo County, the courts have taken the position that because other deadlines are suspended by COVID, as far as hearing times, so are probation violation hearings. And so even though initial hearings, I think, are happening timely generally, final hearings are not. And so they're taking sometimes months to get to a final hearing. And those people are sitting in custody, no bond. So I don't think I had anything else unless the committee had questions for me, but I presume we can get that towards the end. So I believe now it will be Ms. Chavez Cook speaking for us.
Hello, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for having us. And as everyone before me said, I will try to be brief because there's so many of us speaking on this topic today. I wanted to start, I'm going to address technical violations generally and what we might be able to pursue legislatively to make better policy around technical violations. And I want to start with a little bit of statistical information. I'm not giving numbers, just conclusions that came out from recent sort of rigorous nationwide or regional evaluations of the impact of jail as a punishment for technical violations as opposed to what are called community-based sanctions. And what the research shows is that based on random sampling and large samples of probationers, is that punishing people for a technical violation with incarceration does not reduce recidivism, does not have any increased performance on probation outcome in the end. Essentially, there's no evidence to suggest that they're more or less effective than community-based graduated sanctions. Jail sanctions, as opposed to community sanctions, don't bring about suddenly compliance. They don't whip people into shape, in other words. And I did not include in the handout that I gave the committee sources for that information, but I have it right in front of me, and I'm happy to share that with the committee later. The Journal of Criminal Justice is one, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy is another, so I can get citations for that information. With that as sort of a foundation for why we should maybe not incarcerate technical violations, I'll bring us sort of historically up to where we are today. And the House Bill 263 from last year was designed to create a greater distinction between what Representative Maestas was saying in an earlier presentation, the distinction between technical violations and so-called standard violations. But one thing that I think we struggled to give teeth with House Bill 263 was to actually limit incarceration for a technical violation. It made this huge distinction distinction, but then the sections, the provisions that actually had to do with how then to process and punish a violation made no real distinction. It was still perfectly permissible for a probationer to have their probation fully revoked and receive the entire balance of their sentence on a technical violation, just as with a standard violation. So I think my recommendation to this committee would be looking forward to future legislation to try a narrow approach. And I think this is something that the Sentencing Commission Deputy Director Carver mentioned, is that perhaps a narrow piece of legislation that tries to do just one thing might be more effective. My recommendation would be to focus on technical violations, not receiving incarceration. The handout I did provide the committee, which is Legislative Options, I think was the name of the document, breaks that down into basically two steps, the second having two parts. The first is to define technical violations in a way that actually captures the difference between technical and standard violations. The discussion.
It's a white piece of paper, and it says technical probation and parole violations, statutory options to limit incarceration. Is that the right one?
That is the right one, Madam Chair. Thank you. The document name on the CCJ website for people to download it, I think, has a shorter title, but that is the title on the page. Yes, thank you. I should have used that title.
So that's all right.
Defining them in terms of basically the way House Bill 2, conceptually, the way that House Bill 263 did, which was to define a technical violation in contrast to a standard. In other words, anything that's not a standard violation. And then the definition of standard violation becomes the sort of substance, which was absconding or basically committing a new crime. I noticed that during the corrections presentation, it seems sort of agency definition of that doesn't necessarily get at absconding and focuses on just the commission of a new crime. I certainly wouldn't oppose that even more narrow definition, but I think it is likely that absconding would also want to be, that folks would want to treat absconding as well as a standard violation. And so then defining absconding becomes really critical. And that was actually one of the sticking points in last session for the Sentencing Commission discussions during the interim. And then I think when the stakeholders were trying to negotiate the bill during the session, because there is, without including a purpose of avoiding supervision, without including that, you are going to include prototypically technical violations for missed appointments. And I don't want to belabor that point because we spent a lot of time on it during the session last year, and we can certainly get into more detail with it. But the handout does include some authority for why that would need to be part of absconding to make the actual distinction between the standard violation level, something you would want to be able to revoke someone's probation and lock them up for, as opposed to someone who's missed a couple of appointments, which is, in my view, a technical violation sort of at its core. So the other piece that did not come up last session that I think would be really also helpful, it was a big part of the discussions that the Sentencing Commission Reform Committee had during the interim last year, was to make it possible for all probationers, including sex offenders and violent offenders, to benefit from this distinction between technical violations and standard violations without sacrificing public safety. And one of the compromises we had been batting around that didn't ever make it into the bill was to allow, at the time of sentencing, a judge, while they're placing a probationer on probation and saying, you're going to be on probation and you're going to follow the conditions that probation gives you, which is the standard order from the judge. The judge rarely actually specifies the conditions. They leave that to probation and parole to set. To say, but I'm going to specify that for you, the following conditions, even though for anyone else they might be considered a technical violation, will not be a technical violation for you. And if that's in their JNS, then if they violate that condition, they could actually receive incarceration. And the best example I can give for that, because it was sort of the example we used in our discussions, was a sex offender always has as a condition no contact with their victim. And so while a no contact with the victim condition would be non-technical under the definition, it's not absconding and it's not committing a new crime. the judge could specify that for you, that would be treated as a standard violation. And so with that proviso added in addition to the definition of technical versus standard, I think then we account for all probationers not having to get locked up for a traffic ticket or missing an appointment or things like that. So then we move on to sort of the next statutory fix that would have to happen to limit incarceration, and that is two steps. One is to codify the approach that many local jurisdictions already use for technical violations, and I have used in the handout the phrase steps in quotation marks because that's what it's called in some local rules, but it's essentially a graduated sanction process for technical violations. So on the first few, you definitely cannot get jail time, and then as you move your way up and you just keep committing these technical violations, maybe you get very small, short incarceration sanctions, but nothing like a full revocation with the full balance of your suspended sentence imposed. So codifying the STEPS program, which is then included in the handout pages 3 to 4 in detail. And I won't go through it in detail, but just to say that it is essentially a way to ensure this graduated sanction process. And that's at the probation officer level or parole officer level. So they're the ones who are following these steps before they even send it over to the court. There's exceptions built in the language in the handout for being able to go to the court directly in certain circumstances. But otherwise, the default rule would be you don't even go before the judge until you've gone through the steps. And then at the bottom of page 4, we have the court. This is now when we get to court. So then limiting the ability or the parole board for a parolee. And I'm sorry, I keep referring to the court because it's more my universe. I don't do parole revocation practice. But they've gone through the steps, let's say, and they've still committed another technical. They've either tested positive for drug use, or they have or alcohol use, or they've been missing appointments. They're not calling in for their call-ins, that that kind of technical violation. As those start to add up, you can go before the judge and ask for greater sanctions than the probation officer themselves could do. But nevertheless, rewriting the statutory language that's there now in such a way, and I'm looking at page 5, starting with section E, is where this is all new and different from how current law is, or how House Bill 263 approached it. House Bill 263 kept the current statutory language for technical violations, allowing for, again, full revocation. This would limit the court's ability even to fully revoke and impose the balance of the sentence, and would require the court to make special findings to do more than sort of these lesser sanctions approach. And that sounds very loosey-goosey because I don't want to go too much into the detail, but that's what the handout is for. And so with that, I will turn it over to our next presenter, which I believe is Paul Heidel with NMCDLA.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Paul Heidel with the New Mexico Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, and just want to say thank you again for inviting us to speak today. Great to see everybody. I was asked to speak briefly about the role of parole planning and in-house parole in the context of reform and during the COVID pandemic. So for those of you who've been a part of this committee for a while, you know that in-house parole has been an issue with the Corrections Department. Essentially, in-house parole means that a person is being held beyond their release date, serving parole while incarcerated, still in the Department of Corrections. So this is problematic for a couple reasons from a public policy standpoint. First and foremost, from a fiscal standpoint, the amount of someone during their parole in the Corrections Department is significant compared to in the community. Second of all, as we've already heard a little bit earlier today, the purpose of parole is generally to transition someone from incarceration back and allow for reintegration back into the community. And if that's not happening in a community setting, if it's still happening within corrections, it's not fulfilling the purposes. You have someone who would then be released directly from incarceration immediately into the community with no sort of oversight from the Corrections Department, which we know will have a negative impact on how that person's able to reintegrate back into society. So there's a couple of reasons why this continues.
Paul, I'm not sure if you can hear
That's
us,
in the
but
community
you cut out.
we need more of in New Mexico. But there's one, I'm sorry.
Paul, you cut out for a while. So I think you may need to repeat like the last couple of minutes.
Okay. I'm really sorry, Madam Chair. I'm moving to a different place here, having some internet issues.
Okay.
Madam Chair, with the in-house parole, I apologize for that. For those of you that have been a part of this committee, you know that this has been an issue for years in New Mexico and continues to be. I believe the secretary testified earlier that their numbers show about 90 people currently on in-house parole. Those numbers seem to be different depending on when we've heard from corrections in the past, and the calculations that she presented. That's the first I've heard about the multiple counting. But even if 90 people are currently being held on in-house parole, if you assume $40,000 to house an individual in the corrections department, you're talking about $3.6 million per year just on people being held in-house when they should have already been released into the community. So the piece I think maybe that cut out was why this continues to happen within the corrections department. First of all, there is a shortage of beds in the community. We need more beds available to transition people to. Second of all, though, the Department of Corrections has shown a real inability to get people to the parole board on time. That's been an ongoing issue for years with them. And the third piece of that is that they've got such a strict and inflexible approach to their parole plans and what they're approving, even in the midst of a global pandemic. And so we've heard some about the efforts to lower the prison population during the global pandemic. And I want to point to the LFC releases their quarterly report cards on the agencies, and they released one recently from the fourth quarter of 2020 on the corrections department. And when I stood up and moved to a better internet place, I left my notes behind. But essentially, what they said about the governor's executive order of April 6th was essentially that 76 people have been released since that executive order, and 28% of those people were released within 1 week of their out date, and 7 of those people were released the very day before the time that they were scheduled to be released anyway. So it's not having any sort of dramatic effect on lowering the prison population in the midst of this pandemic. The second piece of that we've heard is around the Supreme Court rule change that allows for individuals who are incarcerated to file a motion to reconsider, which would allow a judge to release someone if they were able to demonstrate that they were at great risk due to the pandemic, maybe because they're medically vulnerable or what have you. And that rule change to date has also not produced results. I'm unaware of a single person who has successfully petitioned to be released under that rule change from the Supreme Court to date. And again, that happened back early on in the pandemic. So where does that leave us? Really, it leaves us with comparing in-house parole to last year. That LFC report card, again, is instructional because it says compared to FY19, the Corrections Department has brought down the percentages of people held beyond the release dates, 2.9% for men, 1.7% for women. That's tiny, and that is inadequate in the midst of a pandemic. I appreciate what the Secretary and Melanie said earlier about trying to find creative ways to get people released and back into the community. We need a lot more of that. And the last thing I want to say on that is something that Representative Maestas hinted at earlier, that there are tools already at the corrections disposal that do not require a legislative fix. Those include the Community Corrections Act. The Community Corrections Act each year is highlighted by the Sentencing Commission as to how many people under that act could be safely transitioned into the community. As recently as October of last year, the Sentencing Commission said that 294 people were eligible to be transitioned into the community, still under the control and custody of corrections. And to date, no one has been released subject to the Community Corrections Act, again, in the midst of a global pandemic. So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to highlight that there are some tools at the corrections disposal, along with legislative fixes like Kim mentioned earlier. So I want to turn it over to Barron from the ACLU next. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Madam Chair, members of the committee, I would first like to start by applauding the Corrections Department for the establishment of the Reentry Department. I can tell you through my work over the last couple of years, I connected with several hundred people who have been system involved. And one thing they have in common is that they all had to re-enter society after bouts of incarceration at some point or another. When we look at one's inability to re-enter society and conform and become productive citizens and all the good stuff there, we often view that as individual failing without very little, with a limited lens on the systems that are in play to make that those transitions so difficult. Many of the barriers we see that people face are system constructed. I think Paul touched on some. When you start just with the very basic is housing. The Corrections Department, we all know, everyone on this call knows that, you can be legally discriminated against when you have felony convictions, especially in the housing context. But those issues are also sort of exacerbated when it comes to trying to live with family members who may be system involved. And one thing we do know these days is that many folks of color in Albuquerque and across the nation have some sort of convictions in their background. That makes things difficult. Finding housing is another issue that employment, gainful employment. I think things are looking a little bit up in that department where folks are starting to not use convictions as a strict bar on hiring someone. But what happens is that it leaves really little opportunity for folks to find meaningful employment that they can move forward in life. So it just creates this big old sort of like vacuum, this circular motion where you just sort of trying to survive. Those other challenges like identification. My nephew was recently released from a Michigan prison after 15 years. And although the New Mexico Department of Correctional issues a temporary license for someone, when you're living in the transient, sort of state of being on parole and in flux or in and out of probation, moving around a lot, you can lose that identification. But what they did in Michigan that we can do here to make life a little bit better for folks is to help people get their Social Security and birth certificates before they get out. Because if you lose that license, and I've worked with a couple individuals who were kicked out of a halfway house for some reason or another, and not having that backup identification just created, it creates a place where you just can't, it's almost impossible to move forward. Treatment by the probation and parole secretary's presentation. I think they said that they have 1,300 people entering treatment, being referred to treatment a month. But when you look at the sheer volume of the number of people on supervision, those numbers probably could, should maybe be increased. So, I just want to, if I can emphasize, one thing is that we need to do more to, strengthen the services available to folks who are living, who are being supervised on probation and parole. And really sort of make sure that they have the resources needed. So I really appreciate the new department. I would just like to, hopefully see that department see the department invest in that department. I know that sounds silly, but anyways, yeah. So I'm gonna pass it over to Ricky here in a moment. So we can probably try to save some room for questions because I see it's after 4 o'clock. But just overall, I appreciate you all for taking up this super important topic. But and remember, you know, living on probation and parole, we need to work to just make sure that we're giving people the resources they need to be successful. And as a person who has re-entered society, you know, more times than I would like to remember or talk about, I know those resources are sort of lacking. So I would love to see the department do more investment in that area. I'll turn it over to Ricky Lee.
Thank you, Baron. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Ricky Lee Chavez, and I am the legislative coordinator for the New Mexico Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. Thank you for having us. Thank you for taking up this important topic. I want to just kind of wrap up what this great panel has presented for you and add one more item to a wish list, but it's a very important item. You have heard numbers and figures about the cost of probation and parole and how these technical violations are causing a significant dollar figure to be assumed by the state. So something that we think would help alleviate some of the stresses on the system while also reduce putting those dollars to better use would be to create a fund for community treatment out of the savings that the state would get from eliminating the current or changing the system, with regard to technical violations. So what that would look like as we would contemplate is that a fund would be created with those savings in mind. That money would be put into that fund, and then that fund potentially could be accessed as grant funding or supportive funding for these types of treatment centers that are out there in the state that would help provide, Baron mentioned that there's always a shortage of beds, or there's certain treatment centers or certain places for these individuals to go that have a certain criteria. And so that by creating a community fund and creating a system where we as a state could look into where those gaps are, the community fund would then be able to help fill those gaps and essentially help people re-enter and like Baron said, just kind of support them, put them in a better place to get back on their feet and start. So I don't want to take up too much time because this is a newer idea that we have. I do think that there are so many great individuals on this committee who I would love to chat about how we could make this vision a reality with. Maybe at some point, Senator Ivy Soto would like to help me finagle the words just right. But that is something that I think would help alleviate the stresses that we're seeing on the current system, but also support the new system that's contemplated by a probation and parole reform bill. And so if there's any questions with regard to what that would look like, I'm happy to answer those. And I appreciate the committee's time on this really important topic.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. Are you the last speaker of this section?
Madam Chair, yes, I am. I apologize. I should have said that.
That's fine. I figured as much. I've got more names here than were actually on our agenda. With regard to the language to create a fund, let me just suggest that you might want to visit with someone either on appropriations or possibly House Taxation and Revenue, and maybe Representative Javier Martinez, about the language to do that. That's not a thought that has come up before, but it's probably a good idea because according to the LFC, we're spending $40 million annually on incarcerating people based on technical violations of probation and parole. So I think we could reasonably assume that we're going to have some savings if we don't do that any longer. So next we have the Administrative Office of the District Attorneys and the District Attorney Association to speak.
Thank you. And can you hear me, Madam Chair? This is Marcus Montoya.
Sorry, I said yes to myself. I was muted. Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you and good afternoon, Madam Chair, and good afternoon to the committee members. I'm Marcus Montoya, the 8th Judicial District Attorney. I'm sitting in for District Attorney Diana Luz today as she's in trial. Although I am familiar with the conversations in this subcommittee, I have not been directly involved in the conversations. So if you would please forgive me for my getting up to speed on some of the issues here today, I'd appreciate that. I'm going to start probably at absconding, but I'd also like to see if the committee, if we've got Mr. Henry Valdez from the AODA here, as I know he sat in on a few of these hearings prior, maybe to take the lead on this. Is Henry Valdez present?
And Mr. Valdez is on, so he could do that.
Hello, can you hear me now? I got a terrible echo.
Henry, you have two boxes open here. I think if you close one of them, or we can close it for you, I think.
Okay. Is that better?
That much better.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I've been listening all day, really, and I did like some of the things that I heard from the last presentation. I did appreciate the Public Defender's Office through Kim Chavez Cook acknowledging that not all technical violations are the same. I think that was one of the real concerns that the district attorneys had with the last couple versions of the bill is that, there's some technical violations or what would be considered technical violations within the proposed language that are very serious, such as no contact with victims. There were other violations that may be considered technical but are very important, such as on a domestic violence case, receiving mandatory counseling, which this legislature mandated 52 weeks of. And so those would all be considered technical violations, but they are very important to the success of a probationer. And so I do appreciate the idea that if a judge could designate one of those important conditions, or whether the probation officer was referring to them as special conditions and standard conditions, but if the judge had some way to determine that these are conditions that I find really important, and the reason I'm giving you the chance at probation as opposed to incarcerating you is because I want you to complete these. If a judge would have that ability, I think that certainly would go a long ways in alleviating some of the fears that the district attorneys had. I also want to say that there's going to be several new district attorneys starting January 1st. No matter what happens, there's already going to be new DAs in the 1st, the 3rd, the 4th, the 6th, the 11th, 2, the 12th, and the 13th. So there will be some new ideas coming in from those districts. I also think the DAs had a real concern the last time, and I know we have expressed this to Representative Maestas in the past, is with the definition of absconder. And kind of making it a specific intent proof. and it's difficult to prove a non-act, prove the intent behind a non-act. And so the DAs are also concerned about that. But we look forward to working with the committee on and I want to say that, you know, we will certainly participate as much as this committee allow us and the judiciary committees allow us. We certainly don't want to, and I don't even want to bring it up, but you know, I really want there to be clear communication this time as to exactly what the DAs support, what they don't support, so that there'll be no miscommunication later on down the road, because really nobody wants that, nobody needs that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Montoya.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I think this is very important to you, Chair JC, regarding the definition of absconding, and just a few of my thoughts after listening to today's discussions and the Secretary's definition of how they utilize that in the DOC is much like Mr. Valdez had mentioned. Some of my personal reservations are turning the intent language kind of on its head for a non-act. And what I mean by that is we're trying to take a negative claim and being asked to prove that it doesn't exist. Similar to kind of prove to me that God or the Tooth Fairy doesn't exist. Ask us to claim that a mens rea for a failure to act or something that D did not intend to not abscond, but asking us to prove that that exists. You can't do that by an inductive means. So when the literature says you can do that by circumstantial evidence, it's I think a logical non-starter. You'd have to effectively use double negation to make the proposition of intent to abscond. That's the equivalent of no intent to not abscond. We can't offer that to a judge saying, we have no evidence other than they didn't report. And so that is effectively our evidence that we are going to prove the defendant's intent to not abscond. Right? And so it's kind of a logistical matter, but it just gets convoluted. And again, I think a logical non-starter for us. And so as the absconding definition is contemplated currently, I even have a little bit of reservations using any words that implicate intentional, such as deliberately or willful. Personally, I would prefer absconding means that a person under supervision knowingly makes the person's whereabouts unknown, the person's probation and parole officer, or knowingly fails to report, as opposed to intentionally, deliberately, or willfully, simply for the reasons I stated just now to you, Madam Chair. But again, a matter of semantics and logistical disagreements there, perhaps. And I want to reiterate again what Mr. Valdez said, and acknowledging and thanking what Ms. Chavez-Cook had mentioned as far as not all technical violations are the same. And that is certainly true when you're dealing with even domestic violence cases where there's unwarranted and unauthorized contact from domestic offender to the victim. And that is certainly a concern for the district attorneys. There was a discussion about graduating sanctions versus jail, the benefits, and I think we're all in agreement that we, at this point in 2020, understand and realize that. I think it's just perhaps a procedural, maybe conversation that needs to be had as far as perhaps the STEPS program and these graduated components, because being the district attorney and arguably the most liberal county and the most liberal town in the state of New Mexico, I even sometimes may have reservations about a fourth or fifth or subsequent technical step violation mandating so many days of jail. I am probably of the mindset that if our argument is recidivism and rehabilitation is not improved by incarceration, I don't see personally the benefit in 4 or 5 days, although I do understand the graduation. But that's why I think maybe steps should be still left to the jurisdictions, in as much that every jurisdiction, every judge, every court system, and defense bar and prosecute and district attorney's office, they kind of find, I think, a way to work well with other and with each other. And there is no kind of cookie cutter method by which I think we can implement this statewide. Just some thoughts there, because I know when I am on the ground here, similar to obviously the procedure that happens in the second, as discussed by Mr. Ibarra, we've got our procedural mechanisms, but sometimes we just need to get a offender or defendant in front of a judge. I don't want to say just merely to be admonished, but in order to get the defense attorney and the prosecution in conversation about how to best address whatever may be going on specific to the technical violation. Again, it's not necessarily just I missed a meeting. And again, I'm not, because I'm not familiar, Madam Chair, I don't know if I'm being redundant in previous discussions presented from the District Attorneys Association, but it is not practice in the state of New Mexico for any district attorney's office, of which I'm aware, where we are going to declare you an absconder and issue a bench warrant for your arrest for simply missing one meeting without issuing many attempts to contact the defendant and follows effectively everything that Secretary Tafoya Lucero outlined for, Director Martinez did for the procedures and mechanism by which APPO tries to rein in someone who is missing or who hasn't reported in a certain amount of time. That being said, Madam Chair, ultimately, and I've heard a lot of this subcommittee oftentimes mention that we do want to pursue more promising treatment or rehabilitative programs. A lot of the PEW materials provided for these types of hearings indicate a lot of secured facility treatment centers. And I think it's an overwhelming consensus, especially in this committee, that we have underfunded those more promising programs as stated earlier by Mr. Bauer. So I think we are all effectively in the same mode as far as low-level, first-time, nonviolent offenders not being incarcerated, but that slippery slope does present itself, Madam Chair, when the violations, though seemingly innocent, do directly impact the mom, the dad, the husband, the wife, the spouse, the children, and those families are coming into the district attorney's offices asking us to incarcerate these defendants because nothing else has worked. And through all the graduated systems that we try to employ here, certainly in the 8th Judicial District, but I know in other districts as well. And so at some point, sometimes we're just trying to protect the defendant either from themselves, but certainly from the victims, which are not necessarily victims of the underlying crime, but the families themselves. That being said, I yield my time and stand for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. District Attorney, and nice to meet you. I only have right now Senator Ivy Soto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I hear what you guys say, and what you say sounds great. Here's the problem. The problem is, we had a guy here in New Mexico who was going to leave, filed the paperwork before he was going to leave, saying he was going to go to California. He was going to have to register once he got to California, check in with the authorities, the whole bit. Turns out he never went to California. This was not under the ICAOS. It turns out he never went to California. He went to one of the Dakotas, but he registered when he got to one of the Dakotas. There's the person who was supervising him realized that he never completed a transaction in California, was able to find him in the Dakotas. Why was he able to find him in the Dakotas? Because he was compliant in the Dakotas. So what did they do? Instead of saying, good riddance, at least he's not in New Mexico and he's compliant where he is. Oh no, they issued an interstate warrant for him, flew up to the Dakotas, nabbed the guy at work based on the information he provided, and brought him back to New Mexico. Now, how do we benefit from that as a state? I don't see it. I had a client who was supposed to have a check-in where the check-in was only permitted on Wednesday or Thursday. He miscalculated his days when he was supposed to go check in. And instead, then he ends up missing by a couple days. He's got to go in that next week. Before he could go in that next week, he gets arrested as an absconder. Where did they arrest him as an absconder? At work, where he told them he would be. Now, candidly, I don't think anybody gets points for finding somebody at work where they say they're going to be. But then this guy ends up spending 2 weeks, including a holiday, in jail. The case goes to the grand jury, and not even a grand jury would indict this guy. So when you guys say, well, no district attorney would ever do something like this, I beg to differ, because I've been involved in cases where district attorneys have done exactly things like this. This is exactly the reason why we need a definition of absconding. You know, when every now and then, there's a news article about, hey, we caught 34 people who were absconded. And I always go look at that because oftentimes they have the pictures of the people, right? They love to have the pictures when they do this. Show them off. And you know what I see most of them? I see most of them in their work clothes. So you're taking somebody who is become a productive member of society, who's working a job, and you're yanking them out of there in order to prove a point. Now, I get it. You may feel the need to prove a point, except that isn't the whole point that we want them to get a job and show up every day. And when you yank them out of there, saying, oh, you're an absconder, which makes it sound like we had no idea where they were, that's, you know, I mean, I just have a real problem with that. I have a real problem with that. And so this is the reason why the legislature is now looking to define this. And you guys need to be aware of this. You guys need to be aware that what is going on is a direct reaction to what district attorneys have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Maestas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, presenters. God, there's a lot. I just a couple comments, maybe a couple questions. One is I appreciate the presentation by Kim Chavez Cook with regards to not just leaving it as standard violation or technical violation, but what should we do statutorily with some of those technical violations. And there's a, you know, and it's just a question of getting the words on the page right, you know. Because you're right, there are technical violations that are frankly more serious than maybe some misdemeanor crimes. You mentioned one, you're violating no contact orders, but also if someone is severely on the bad path with narcotic drugs, particularly methamphetamine, then that's a serious technical violation in my opinion. So how do we give the probation officer the teeth they need to enforce public safety while not making the decisions they've been making the past 10, 20, 40 years, which many of them have nothing to do with public safety. You know, everything should be focused on public safety. And, you know, putting someone in prison for a technical violation, the studies bear out that that's actually contrary to public safety. So anyway, I can go on and on, but just anyway, great ideas from the chief and from Mr. Ibarra, Ms. Chavez, Mr. Heidel, Mr. Jones, always great perspective. And I want to thank DA, Madam Chair, DA Montoya for jumping in. Ms. Luz is in trial. But there's 13 judicial districts, Madam Chair. There's 14 elected DAs. How many, assuming all the incumbents win, which I hope they do, how many new DAs will we have, Madam Chair, Mr. Valdez? Come January.
Madam Chair, Representative Maestas, we will have a new district attorney in the 1st, a new district attorney in the 3rd, a new district attorney in the 4th, a new district attorney in the 6th, a new district attorney in 11-2, a new district attorney in the 12th, and a new district attorney in the 13th.
Wow.
So there will be quite a quite a bunch of
Seven.
That's 7 of the 14.
Wow, fantastic. Fantastic. Great lawyering. It's a huge step. It's a huge responsibility to take on that job in those jurisdictions. So that's great news. I look forward to working with the new DAs, because to me, the best thing the DAs can do for us as lawmakers is let us know what the words on the page how it will play out in their opinion. Because they may not agree with the bill, but at least you could say, hey, page 2, paragraph 3, you need to change that, And I really enjoyed working with you and the DAs this past 30-day session on knowing that you weren't thrilled with the bill, but that we could come to some good policy agreements. But keep in mind, there's just a lot of years we need to mend. I recall, Madam Chair, the DAs came to us, I believe, in 2007 to amend the embezzlement bill to consolidate embezzlement as one crime because it's easier to prosecute and easier to calculate, and it's 9 years, so that's a sufficient penalty for white-collar crimes. And in the very last committee, I believe Al Park was the chair, we took out the magic words for each individual crime or something like that. And the lawyers said it was superfluous. We didn't need that in statute. And so it's not in statute currently, but yet DAs are still asking for stacked sentences on some white collar crimes. And so that's just some of the apprehension we've had in the past. And I think all that stuff is now laid to rest. I think we could move forward with a new relationship to really move forward on some good public safety policies. But I think just it's just a shame we couldn't get that done. Because we'd now be having a hearing on how great the new law is instead of rehashing it for I think the third year in a row. But just a reminder, Madam Chair, DAs, if there's any DOC folks listening, it's been 18 months since the probation bill passed last March. 18 months for the probation department, for the DAs to move in the direction of proven public policy, and I don't see that happening. So now you have 9 months, I suppose, before July 1st, in anticipation of new public policy. I would just urge you all to start doing what's in those bills now and not wait till July 1st, because it's really about a cultural change, whether the probation department wants the folks on the other side of the desk to succeed or is just so bureaucratic that they enforce all of the provisions of their standard contract to the fullest extent without any rhyme or reason to public safety. That's really what the department has become, even though they have a hard time admitting it. But anyway, look forward to working with you all, and appreciate all the time and effort that everyone's put into this bill. I really think we could have the best bill in the country, and just appreciate all the minds taking a look at it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Maestas. And I want to let you know that Secretary left a message that she had to leave, but she's looking forward to additional questions via email, and then also referred us to her website. So that's in the chat box if you want to see that. And I'm looking to see Senator Cedillo Lopez. Do you have questions? Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's really important when we're talking about the burdens of proof. I think it's really important that we think about what is the goal, and what exactly do we want to have happen at these hearings. And so I appreciated the comment about proving a negative. Although I'm not positive that I agree with how it was framed, I am very supportive of the idea that we need to make the elements very clear. And I also think it's very important that we ensure that victims of domestic violence and sexual assault have their protective orders very, very clear, and that's not, I don't understand how that could even be considered a technical violation to violate that kind of condition. And I would certainly want to make sure that that's not the case in any bill that we rewrite. And then finally, I just wanted to invite the DA's Association to meet with those of us working on the police accountability bill, to really give us our input. I've talked to individual district attorneys, but I have not really. I understand that the association is aware of the bill and has discussed the bill, but I would be very interested in getting their input before we introduce the bill, and that we fully understand each other's perspective. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there other members with questions or comments on? We had the Sentencing Commission, and then we had the Public Defender and Criminal Defense Lawyers and the ACLU, and then we've had the district attorneys. So I invite further questions from committee members. Anybody? So let me, nobody's popping up, but I'll certainly let someone go ahead, even though I'm usually the cleanup batter here. Mr. Montoya, DA Montoya, you haven't heard my story of my client. I think Senator Ivy Soto's stories were worse than mine, but I represented a client who had been in prison. He'd done hard time, and he was the one being reunified with the children who were in state custody in a CYFD case. So he is in Valencia County, and he has phone trouble, he has car trouble, he's not dealing drugs, he's trying to get his kids to school, he's trying to deal with all of the responsibilities of being a single parent again, and he was having trouble always getting to his appointments. For one thing, he had to have childcare because you can't take your children to a probation office because there are former felons around there. And so he ended up getting revoked twice. And it wasn't the district attorney that started the process. As you know, it's the probation officer. And he said to me at one point, he said, you know, she's really young and she doesn't have any children, and I just don't think she understands what the demands are. So he lived in the same house. He had the same job. He was working kind of as a landscaper, just doing manual labor. And really, he could have always provided a clean UA if he could get his ride and get to the office. And the office was notorious for not answering its phone. So it was really hard for him to take care of that. But in the process of getting revoked twice, the trial home visit was disrupted, and the kids went back into technically foster care, where the state's paying for foster placement. It was with a family, fortunately, but there's so many stories like that. And so I guess I agree with Senator Cedillo Lopez. You want the elements to be clear, but isn't saying that someone had an intent to abscond the same as you're proving intent for anything, any crime for mens rea? I guess I just don't see how it becomes somehow proving a negative. It seems that you're going to prove a positive somehow through conduct of the probationer, the person who's violating. So I really appreciate the fact that people have put so much thought into it. And I joined Representative Maestas in suggesting that anybody who wants to start doing anything along these lines, there's probably no prohibiting that being done sooner rather than later. But I hope we can get a statutory change this coming session. So I think we have some public comment, and I wanted to let Erin Bond know that she can let those folks speak now if they're ready to do so.
Madam Chair, we have Carla Flowers. Carla, you're muted. Hi, everybody. Some of you may remember my name, Madam Chairman, and everybody of the committee. I want to thank you for letting me talk. I spoke at the subcommittee about my daughter who's currently incarcerated, and I've been sitting here today listening to this committee also. And I just want to remind you to keep in mind the mental health element of everything that you are considering. And that was one question I had about, I believe it was Ms. Martinez who brought up about the Omni program, the new one. And I'm just curious if that has any form of a mental health assessment to it. Let me just give you a brief thing about my daughter. She would be considered an absconder. She was in the probation department. She and her probation officer, I guess, just did not get along, and she was pregnant when she was on probation, and her officer, she had a high-risk pregnancy, had to see an OB 70 miles away. She ran into her probation officer after her appointment at a restaurant. And her probation officer says, I could violate you right now because I gave you permission to go to your doctor, not eat lunch. Okay, so the probation office sent her to counseling. They said she didn't need drug counseling, so they gave her parenting classes. And then they said, oh, we think you may have postpartum. Sent her to counseling, but they weren't able to give her an appointment for more than 30 days out. But she did go, and they diagnosed her with chronic PTSD. And then through a series of things that happened, if anyone wants to contact me, you can, and I'll tell you more. But she is now incarcerated in Grants. And when she got there, they said, no, you don't have chronic PTSD. You have complex PTSD, along with 3 other mental health issues. You add those 4 mental health issues in with postpartum, it's not good. And she was facing 30 years in prison. And I think had she gotten help sooner, perhaps through probation and parole, that maybe we could have found out these conditions sooner. Everyone that has come in contact with her since she's been on her medication say she's 100% changed already. And I think a lot of people out there might be helped by more mental health screening through probation and parole, and you may see less recidivism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Flowers. We really appreciate that. If you want to email our staff attorney your contact information, that would be great. I'm not sure how we get that to you, but we can figure that out.
Okay.
And who else do we have, Erin?
Madam Chair, we also have William's uncle.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I heard?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, fine. Madam Chair and committee members and others that presented today, lovely presentations. My point would be this, that number one, we've heard from the after sentencing situation with the Department of Corrections. Once one is sentenced, one ends up in the Department of Corrections, and so we've heard from that department. We've also heard the next step from probation and parole, essentially after serving a sentence, the conditions for remaining outside of incarceration. And the next that we heard from was the Public Defender's Office and some detail and changes that could be implemented that would streamline the definitions of what would result in a person either being counseled or reincarcerated for probation violations. And I thought that was a very good presentation. The part that we have not heard from, and the part that I have been mostly involved in, we've not heard from the inmates nor the family of the inmates. Now, the committee hears what the overall objectives are for each of these departments, but they don't have the opportunity to learn from the inmates how that is implemented, in fact, in the prison. Just because somebody is in prison does not mean that they'll tell a lie if they're asked about how did it go. So I think now I would recommend that the committee make a provision to have input from inmates. I don't know exactly how to do it, but I would like to work very much like to work with committee members that would be interested in pursuing this. I can contact legislators about my contact information and all of that, but my name is Bill Zunkel, and I followed the process of a couple of inmates, and it isn't exactly all happening as is presented. So I think you need to know some of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zunkel. And you know, it's interesting. We used to have a regular group of families who had family members who were incarcerated who spoke with us. And I know one of my constituents is usually here, and she had to do her granddaughter's homeschooling today to help her daughter out, so she wasn't able to be with us. But we often do hear from folks who have very close contact with those who are incarcerated. And Edenfeld is one who's with us often and can give us that perspective. But I think, you know, when we do tour the corrections facilities, we get to visit with inmates, but having their voice at these meetings would probably be a good idea. Maybe the ACLU can help us with that too.
Good, thanks very much.
Do we have anybody else, Erin?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure if Candace Littlefoot had wanted to provide public comment.
Great.
Candace, you're unmuted. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, Chairwoman, members of the committee. I'm Candace Littlefoot. I'm a policy associate with Bold Futures. Just really appreciate all the conversations that we're having today in regards to probation and parole. Our organization stands for Women of Color and People of Color here in New Mexico. We know that these policies and these laws definitely impact people of color in our community, especially Indigenous communities. So just wanted to thank everybody for their time and consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate it. Do we have anyone else, Erin?
Madam Chair, I believe that's everyone.
Okay. So, committee members, if you would email Elizabeth Johnson, how about by the end of the week? It's a Monday, by Friday. And perhaps you could send out a reminder email, Elizabeth. And I know Elizabeth has sent you an invitation that was emailed to me about a meeting which legislators can attend by Zoom about women's programs in Valencia County. And so I wanted to make sure that you all have that. And you could send that as well to Representative Fajardo was on at the committee most of the day. And then also, if you would, to Representative Cadena, she was watching the committee through the webcast and sent me some comments during the testimony and so forth. So that would be good. Let everybody know about that. And if you get a chance, please review that link to the article on independent oversight of corrections. So any other committee members want to say anything before we adjourn? And we're going to actually adjourn 11 minutes early, which is really nice. Any comments from anyone?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Good meeting.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you,
Madam Chair. It was
everybody.
very helpful.
We have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
Thanks all of you for attending today. I really, really appreciated it. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Madam Chair. Good meeting.
Thank you.